Cool. We are now live. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all doing? This is Chris's Speaker's Corner, and in today's live stream, we're going to be continuing the trend of last week. On last Friday, I did a very similar thing. I had a live stream where I had Muslims join me on stage where they could debate a particular topic. Last week, it was the Islamic dilemma. This week, it's going to be something new. It's going to be in the vein of Quran preservation and how Muslims understand how the Quran has been preserved. We're going to have Muslims on stage, hopefully, assuming they want to join and have this kind of dialogue, and see if they can defend their particular way of understanding how the Quran has been preserved. Now, I obviously have my own opinion on this. I've made videos where I've talked about this previously. I've had Dr. Fadel Soliman on this channel. I interviewed him, where he, being someone who knows both Arabic and has also written a book about the, perhaps we could say, different variants of the Quran. I have learned from my conversation with him, and that's obviously helped form my opinion. So the first thing I am going to do is I'm going to put the link up before I forget, and then I'm going to go through kind of like a prepared PowerPoint. I actually gave this at a conference a few months back, but since I already have this material, it seems pretty useful just to go through it with you, and then we can get some people on stage and see how it goes. So the first step is going to be for me to post this in live. So let's do that. Okay, just pin the message. It should now be at the top of the chat. And you can see that I've clearly said Muslims only for this. I will have some guests on who are not Muslims, but in terms of just people from the chat, just people who are Muslims who have an opinion on this, who want to defend the idea that the Quran is preserved. And I'll be very interested to see what Muslims have to say, because I think they're going to struggle. I think they're going to really struggle with this, because I think the Quran is not preserved in the way they think it is. I don't think the Quran has been perfectly preserved at all. In any sense, perfect preservation is not a thing when it comes to the Quran. So let's start on this presentation. Okay. Cool. So what do Muslims mean when they talk about preservation? What are they actually getting at? What is the core understanding of that as a doctrine? I'm going to make the case that Muslims today have presented something that is not only not what early Muslims believed, but rather is just flat out in error. It is something that is demonstrably false. You can show very quickly and very easily that the Quran is not preserved according to their understanding, the idea that it has been perfectly preserved. And not only this, but I think it actually does a disservice to Muslims when people who are supposedly of knowledge try to explain, I guess, or to inform other Muslims who are not so knowledgeable that in their religion, in Islam, the Quran is perfectly preserved, word for word, letter for letter, dot for dot. There has been no change to the Quran whatsoever. And they might quote a Quran verse to try and justify that, but this is what they tell people. And I absolutely think that that is not true. And I think at best, this is just a misunderstanding from the person who supposedly knows this sort of thing. And at worst, I think it's just an outright lie. I think people know full well that this isn't the case. This isn't what early Muslims believed. This is something that people are saying to Muslims as a way of encouraging them in their faith and to try to prevent them from being exposed to material that would shake their faith and get them to question some other things that they have been told by Muslim scholars, by their imams, by different sheikhs. Now, I'm always wanting to present things as clearly and as close to the truth as I possibly can. I want to get rid of as much rhetoric as I can and just present things factually. So in that vein, I'm going to go through this and we're going to go through different aspects. And maybe after I've done this or as I'm doing it, we'll see how we go. If I get people who want to come up, they can do. So let's start this first real quick. Here we go. So I've made the case this is important. I think this is really important. I think it's important because Muslims believe something that is just absolutely not true. And it's demonstrably not true. There is no sense that this is true, and it is something that can be shown to be false very easily. They think that there is one Quran, and it's been perfectly preserved. I don't think there's one Quran. I don't think that's a correct way of looking at the Quranic materials. I don't think that's a correct way of looking at history from even an Islamic point of view. I think there's many Qurans, many Arabic Qurans. And I think I can demonstrate that tonight to any Muslim who's watching. And if you are watching, I would suggest you pay close attention to the things that I bring up, because if you haven't heard this before, some of this will be quite shocking. There are many Muslims. I know to many of my audience, this probably isn't very shocking, but there are many Muslims I've had the pleasure of meeting at Speaker's Corner who genuinely believe there is just one Quran. There's just one. And the sad thing is that is absolutely not true, according to Muslims. Even Muslim scholars acknowledge that there is not just one Quran. There are, in fact, many differing Qurans, and there needs to be a way of understanding what that relation is and how Muslims are to understand that. And this is why I say it's a known lie. Because anyone who I've spoken to people who are knowledgeable, who know this sort of material, and I asked them very clearly, look, is it just one Quran? There is no others. There is nothing else. It's just 100% agreed upon. There are no differing verses. There are no ayah of difference. There's nothing like that. It's just one. And they will look at me in the eyes and they'll say yes. And then I'll bring up the different qira'at. I'll bring up the aruf. And then all of a sudden, it's like you've opened a can of worms. And they get nervous because of what you just said. Because they've realized you're aware of things. And people that do that to other Muslims, that gets to me. That really does. I don't like that. So I'm going to quickly go down through some of basically the history, what Muslims believe historically happened as part of their faith, to how the Quran came to be written down after it was recited through Jibreel to Muhammad. So Muhammad couldn't write, supposedly according to their tradition. There are differing accounts on this, but let's just go with what they say. They say he couldn't write. He couldn't read, he couldn't write. Fine. So the companions had to write down the Quran on materials during his lifetime. There was not a compiled Quran during the lifetime of Muhammad. Rather, it was written in different materials in a dispersed manner that was owned collectively by many different people. And it wasn't just in one book, it wasn't in one collection, it was in different rocks, different leaves, different all sorts of things, bones, and it was scattered across the Hijaz in some shape or form. Now, Muhammad died, and the Quran hasn't been written down. So 2 years after Muhammad's death, so you're talking about 634 AD, there is a plan put into motion by Abu Bakr and Zayd bin Thabit to have the Quran written down for the first time in like a uniform sense. So not just little bits and pieces here and there. We're going to get it all together and we're going to put it in one collection. Great. Sounds absolutely amazing. Now, key point here. They did not do this just from memory. There is nothing that says they did this just from memory. But rather they point out the kinds of ways that they got this information. And they mention two different types of sources. They mention orally, from those who had memorized good parts of it, which was limited because of the Battle of Yamama. And yes, that is a hilarious name. But at the Battle of Yamama, many people who had recited the Quran had died. So there was a concern that eventually maybe all of them would die. So it needs to be written down quickly. So that's one source, orally. The second source is from written materials. Like I mentioned before, right? So you have leaf stalks, you have bones, you have rocks, you have any kind of material that could have inscriptions of parts of the Quran written down on them. So they got these two kinds of materials together, and through those materials in combination with each other, they managed to write down the Quran 2 years after Muhammad died. Great stuff. So far, so good. Now, weirdly, in the Islamic tradition, they don't really do much with it. They have this copy from Abu Bakr, who's then gets handed down to Umar and then to Hafsa, and then it eventually ends up under her pillow. It isn't really used. It doesn't do anything. It's basically just going to stay there for many years and become dormant. remember, this is a huge task that has been undertaken by Abu Bakr, so much so that Abu Bakr even doubted whether or not it could be done. He actually says, as part of hadith material, how can I do this when Muhammad never told us to do this? It would be easier to like move a mountain, I think is the analogy he uses. So this was a very difficult thing to do, and they do it, but then they just keep the results underneath someone's pillow eventually. I mean, it takes years for that to get under a pillow, but why does it end up like that? It's such a strange thing in the traditions to think that that's what people would do. I don't think that's historic for kind of obvious reasons. Why on earth would you go to all this trouble to write a codex? Write the Quran down for the first time. Awesome, we've finally done it. Should we make copies of it? Should we distribute it? Should we use it in mosques? No, we're just gonna do nothing with it, and eventually it's gonna go under Hafsa's pillow. But anyway, 20 years pass after this Quran is put together, and eventually does nothing and goes under Hafsa's pillow. But okay, 20 years have gone past. There are reports that people further north, because in this 20-year period, Islam has spread. It's gone out of Saudi Arabia. It's now entered, for example, into North Africa. It's now entered into Middle East. It's now entered kind of into the Indian regions. So we now have a situation where there are differing groups who are reciting the Quran differently. And this is causing problems. People have anxieties about this. It's like, hang on a second, whoa. We can't have this group of people saying the Quran is this, and this group of people saying the Quran is this. They are saying different things and they are arguing with each other. That cannot be allowed to continue. And the actual hadith material, the sayings that are part of the Islamic tradition, they actually record that people said, let us not differ like the Jews and the Christians differ. So they thought this was substantial, and they were actually contrasting it with other groups. So Uthman, the fourth caliph at this point, he just the caliph at this point, Uthman, he then comes forward and says, okay, cool, I'll have an answer for this. I'm going to put together a committee, and I'm going to get Zayd bin Thabit back in as well. And we're now going to take the codex that was under Hafsa's pillow, that isn't being used, and we're going to take that with other Quranic material, and we're going to use that to do another Quran, another copy of it, so to speak, the Uthmanic copy of the Quran. And then we're going to burn everything else. We're going to destroy everything else. Any Quranic corpus material, whether it's on bones or leaves or copies or whatever it might be, we're going to destroy it. We're going to standardize the Quran into just this one, and it's going to have Uthman's seal of approval on it, and it's going to be all good. And no one's going to argue anymore. Sounds absolutely great. But it doesn't go too well. So, first of all, we actually know at this period in time that there were other companions who differed already into what Uthman was trying to get this Quran to look like. So we have Abdullah ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. Both of these people are companions. They are part of the Sahaba of Muhammad. And they are, according to valid hadith, sound hadith, they are considered some of the greatest reciters of the Quran. In fact, Muhammad actually says people should learn the Quran from these people. He also mentions others as well, but these are two that are given in the hadith. The issue, of course, is that these guys differed on what the Quran was. Now, Abdullah ibn Masud, he had his copy of the Quran, and it had 111 chapters in it. Ubay ibn Ka'b had his own copy of the Quran with 116 chapters in it. Well, hang on a second. How many chapters are there in the Quran today? There are 114 chapters in the Quran today. So neither of them got it right? How does that work? And how is it they could have got the whole thing totally so distorted according to what we have today, given that these guys are like meant to be the best of the best? If you want to learn the Quran, you go to these two guys, but they're going to tell you different things, which is difficult. It's important to note as well, Ubay ibn Ka'b and Abdullah ibn Masud were not invited by Uthman. Now, when Uthman's putting together his Quran, he gets all the different materials, right? He also gets people who have memorized good parts of the Quran. Who would have been some of the best people who have invited to this committee to write a copy of the Quran? Who would have been some of the best people? Well, it would have been these guys, Abdullah ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b. But they're not invited. Presumably because he knows they have differences in their Quran codices. Uthman just sidelines the whole issue. He's like, no. I got Zayd ibn Thabit. I got members of my family. I've got Hafsa's codex under a pillow. We got some guys who've memorized stuff, and we've probably got some rocks, some leaves, some bones. That is it. We're going with this. That to me tells me that there was contention very early on what the Quran was. So this is where things get a bit more complicated. But basically, Uthman, so he writes his codex, right? Uthman, he's got stuff he wants. He's got Hafsa's codex. He's got all these things. I'm not going to have Abdullah ibn Masud. Not going to have Uwais ibn Ka'b. We don't need those guys. No point. I'm just going to do what I've got with materials I have, destroy everything else. And this is the only official Quran. Anything else is not a Quran. It needs to be destroyed. Well, he makes copies of his own copy, and he distributes them to important cities across the Islamic Empire. And there's varying traditions about which cities these are, but you could say things like Medina, Mecca, Kufa, Basra, and Syria, or potentially Damascus. Like, these seem to be roughly the areas that he sends these copies to. They aren't the same. They're not the same copies. They aren't like for like identical copies. Scholars, and even in the Islamic histories, Islamic scholars wrote about it, and they said, hey, we know that in Mecca, the Uthmanic copy they have, that Uthman sent to them, has a variant that is not present in our copy of the Uthmanic Quran that we were sent. Ooh, that's interesting. So it looks as if they're not the same. There's differences. And you see what's interesting is Marin van Putten here on Myth Vision, when he's talking to Derek, he actually goes on to say, well, I think they're best explained by scribal differences. As in, these are errors that scribes have introduced into the text, not intentionally, but because they are very minor and because they don't seem to be intentional, it looks as if they are just errors. So now we have a problem. The Uthmanic Codex, which is supposedly the standardized Quran, has errors in it. How can we say the Quran is perfectly preserved? The Uthmanic Quran, which is as far back as we can really go with the textual tradition, has errors. Straight away, we have huge issues. Now, I'm going to invite some guys on stage here because I've got some guys who are patiently waiting. So I'm going to bring up Ibn Dawood. I'm going to bring up Rob Sentinel as well. Hello, both you guys. How you doing?
Good. How you doing?
Doing good. I saw you guys just came straight from Testify's live stream as well, which is awesome.
We're doing the rounds.
Doing the rounds, yeah. Can you guys just talk for a sec? I want to check an audio thing.
Sure. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep. There we go. Rob, speak. I can't hear you, Rob.
Neither can I, Rob. Something's wrong with your...
Okay, well, I'm going to wait for Rob to sort his audio out. As soon as I hear you, then we'll know that's all good. But yeah, is there anything you want to add, Dawood? Otherwise, I'm going to continue on with the next slide.
It'd be great if you gave... So I'm just curious about, actually, this is a question I wanted to ask you for a while, actually. Do we know what these variations are in the original, or in the 5 that were commissioned by Uthman?
Yes. For example, Marin actually gives one. I can play the video if you like to. Let's do the video. It's annoying because I got this slide up, but I can't actually play the video from it, which is terrible. But let's bring up the actual video itself.
How's my audio now?
Hey, I can hear you now. That's all good.
There we go.
Good.
Okay.
Uthman did allow for a slight variance.
I don't think I can hear that. Let's try this.
In the rusum of his codices.
Oh, wow. I just heard myself. That was quite right. Okay, cool. Can you guys hear this all right?
Yep. Some particular variations, like prepositions and particles, but not words or phrases. So according to Abu Ubaid ibn Salam, Uthman's 6 codices were in 99.999% agreement in the rusum. There was a difference of 43 characters out of almost 374,000 characters, and this was intentional. So the committee did accommodate for a few of the well-attested particular variations that very slightly altered the rusum, okay, the consonantal skeleton. For example, in the Meccan Codex, in the codex sent to Mecca, okay, there is an additional preposition min in verse 100 of the 9th surah. Okay, that does not appear in the other codices. So that is 2 characters, a meme and a noon. All right, there are a few more of these totaling 43 characters across 6 codices. So again, these were intentional. They were accommodating various authorized readings.
Variants that we find in these 4 master copies, and there are very few of them. So there's about 40 of them, and they are tiny. Right? They're things like one copy has qalu, they said, and the other has waqalu, and they said. Those are the kinds of differences we're talking about. Now, those really don't matter. Right? They amount to nothing, and the idea that someone would care so much about it to include both of those variants seems silly. Why? Especially in light of the why was Uthman standardizing the text? He was standardizing the text because there was a lot of variation around it. He was like, I'm going to, get the whole community on to agree on this one text, because there was all the variation. They weren't arguing about whether a verse started with "and" or not. They were arguing about what the verse even said. So the fact that the idea that they really wanted to include these variants seems very unlikely to me. It looks like scribal errors to me. I mean, that's what it's like.
So, did we hear that? It looks like scribal errors to me. So,
because when Ali Attai was given his reason, he said, Uthman approved these. Why?
So
no reason.
So what you saw there was 2 different perspectives. The first part was blogging theology with Paul Williams, who was interviewing someone who was giving his opinion, and then you saw Derek on Myth Vision, and he was interviewing Marin Van Putten, and he was giving his opinion. So Marin is just basically saying, look, they're so minor. How on earth can they be intentional? They look like scribal errors. The question you have to ask as a Muslim is, wait. If you believe the Quran is perfectly preserved, it doesn't even get this far, because you get to Uthman, and then Uthman writes down the Quran, and he writes it wrong. There are variants in it. So the doctrine of perfect preservation goes out the window completely. The letter for letter, word for word, dot for dot idea, poof, straight out the window. Even Uthman couldn't do that. And we know, and this isn't like controversial. This is known by scholars all over the world. In Islamic tradition, they know there are variants in the codices. So that's kind of what I want to illustrate with that. It's not the magnitude of the variants; it's the fact that there are variants.
There's a comment by John Geometers. Roofed.
Roofed. Yeah.
By the way, the guy that was speaking on Paul Williams' YouTube, just FYI, he's a flat earther. He actually argues for flat earth through the Quran. Yeah, he's a flat earth Muslim. Just FYI.
There are a few of those that I've seen. What's his name? Shamsi, I think, is a flat earther. Yeah.
He's a flat earther and also a geocentrist.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And his understanding is, look, the early scholars seem to look at it that way. So therefore, yeah. Okay, so what actually is the Quran? Now, this is something that I can't get an answer to, and I would love for Muslims to come on and give me an answer to, because I don't think there is one. According to tradition, Muhammad had the Quran recited to him in 7 different modes. Jibreel will come to him, recite in one way, then recite in another way, and another way, and another way, another way, another way, all the way up to 7 different ways. Now, the problem I have with this is we don't know what they are. And this is why when you look at scholarship, they just tend to refer to it as either the Arabic term, they don't write it in an English equivalent, they would just say aruf. These are the 7 aruf, this is what it is. Or they would say, it's different modes. It's the 7 modes. We don't actually know what this is in terms of, is this talking about like different ayahs, different verses of the Quran being different? In what sense are they different? Are they different like thematically? Are there different topics or different categories in a sense? Or is it talking about surahs? Maybe it's talking about chapters. Maybe it's entire chapters. maybe it's not. The issue is that we don't have any more information to work from. So all we can do is guess at what this is. We don't know what this is. It's been lost to time, if it ever was known. And because of that, I would argue very clearly that if Muhammad revealed the Quran in 7 different ways, 7 different modes, that is the revelation from Allah, according to the Islamic perspective, and we do not have this anymore, then we have lost the majority, in a real sense, of the Quran. Because that aruf, or at least 6 out of 7, 5 out of 7, depends on how you look at it, is lost. It doesn't exist. It's gone. And I challenge any Muslim to show me what the aruf is explicitly, to show me it in terms of the actual recitation, where it differs. Explain to me how you know this. Explain to me that this is something you derive from the Salaf, through the Sunnah, or the Quran, and show me that this can be defended. Because I don't think it is. I don't think you can show me this at all. I think that every Islamic interpretation is purely hypothetical and without evidence. No explanation for this at all. The Quran is revealed in 7 ways. We don't have them anymore. The majority of the Quran has been lost. And it's up to a Muslim to show me otherwise. So
let's is it possible to do some thought experiments just to, like, for the fun of it, I suppose?
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's summarize so far what you're arguing. So, and this is still an area that I have like a surface level knowledge on, but I'm still, it is still very complicated, like, to try and really grasp the bigger picture of the implications of this. But based on what I'm understanding so far is the Quran emerges as from a singular voice, Muhammad. He's claiming it's Allah speaking through him, right? And so kind of like the other guy on Myth Vision, when he says, if a verse says and XYZ versus no and, like if and is included or removed, right? The point is that when Muhammad was literally speaking in real time, say the word and was part of that sentence, then the removal of and is impossible, because Muhammad used the word and in that very moment, right? So the moment there's a disappearance of and, oops, there's a textual variant, in other words. But are you saying that Muslims are saying, or within Islamic discussions or whatever, that when you have a compilation, it's like a weird ghost-like lurking the background, so to speak? It is a form of textual criticism that they're having to deal with, but they're saying that Allah is the one that inspired it in like 7 different ways or something. Like, so in other words, you can include an and, but you don't also need to include an and, because see, it can mean the same thing in different, like, depends. It's kind of like Obi-Wan Kenobi. From a certain point of view, right? What I told you is true from a certain point of view. Yeah. So is it sort of like that, or is it?
So they would what they're going to
okay,
say, just
Yeah.
to go through their position, would be the aruf. Well, actually, there are different positions depending on where you boil down to the status of the aruf, right? Are they still around? Like, do we still have these 7 different modes? Have they been lost? Because there are Muslims that do actually think they have been lost in some way. Some would say only one has been preserved, and that is the preservation that is found through the Uthmanic text. So in effect, when Uthman wrote down the Quran, he preserved 1 aruf. All the others went. They've been lost to time. We can't tell you what they were. There's another position that says, well, actually, we do have some of the aruf, like on the 3 out of 7, 4 out of 7, something like that. They have managed to make their way into the Qira'at somehow. We can't tell you where, because we can't identify these, but we know that they're there because they're there. Yeah. That's really it. It gets very bizarre when they try and explain how they can identify these things, but they can't. So, and the final position is just that all of the Aruf has been preserved and they kill out.
Yeah, so just to clarify, if they were to identify, the only way would be if you actually had the carbon copy original to then categorize chronologically. Number 1 is here, number 2 is here, number 3 is here. So, in other words, going back to that first position, like the first argument that Muslims make, that you brought up, for them to say that the one that comes down, right, from Uthman, you would have to logically say that goes directly back to Muhammad. You can't have that as some sort of like mutated version of Muhammad's message. It has to be originally Muhammad's that then maybe spills out into these.
Well, the question
but that's an argument from silence. How do you defend that? How do you say that goes back to Muhammad?
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, how can you differentiate between the Aruf supposedly making its way into Qur'an later on and scribal errors? Like, how can you do that?
Yeah.
Well, suspiciously, a lot of the Qur'an can a very minor changes in vowels and so on in the Arabic, which changed it just enough to be important. You know, it's not like these are just radical changes to the skeleton text. These are changes to consonantal, not the rasm, but the actual dots that are used to identify different letters in the Arabic. That's quite a minor change. So again, you need a methodology for splitting that between mistakes that well-meaning people have made, or this is actually just one of the ways that Muhammad gave the Quran. But of course, this doesn't neatly line up into 7, which is one problem. Because again, this is meant to be 7 different modes, the Aruf. Well, we would expect to see 7 of some variants, right? But we don't, not in any sense. So that seems to have gone by the wayside. Either it's been lost, or in all honesty, maybe it's just false. My own interpretation of this is that I think Muslims came up with this as a way of understanding why there are variants. Because without it, if you wanted to think of the Quran as a holistic text that doesn't have any disagreements ever, you couldn't, because it would just be obvious, right? You would just go to a different part of the Islamic Empire and see that they recite slightly differently when they get to Surah 10, Ayah 16, or Surah 37, Ayah 12. And it's just, well, how do I explain that? Either that guy's not saying the Quran, and I am saying the Quran, in which case I need to do something about that, or we're both saying the Quran, it's just that the Quran is more than what we previously thought. And I think that's the opinion they came down to. It's as weird as it is, but it makes sense.
It's always been this like humorous image in my mind, which I don't think has been suggested before, but basically you're bringing it up, that imagine if you have 2 Muslims from across the world bumping into each other, doing their own, I don't know, devotions or something, and then he overhears the other one adding words or subtracting certain words, and he's like, no, you're reciting the Quran wrong.
Well,
and then
that's actually what happened. It's like, according to the Hadith. In fact, in the Hadith, they would almost come to a fight over this stuff. So no, you're not wrong there.
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
That's what's so bizarre. Like, this is their tradition. They think this happened, and it goes back to Muhammad.
And
Muhammad
hence the big Yasakari holes in the narrative. Like, hence why that statement is so necessary in this.
Well, I mean, with Yasakari, it's interesting because I think David Wood pointed this out. Yasakari's dad was also a scholar, and his dad, I think, was the one who used to say there's only one Quran kind of thing. So I could be wrong. Forgive me if I am, Yasakari. But from what I've heard, he's basically continuing in the tradition of his dad. But he's also trying to not do that as such, because he knows... Because, I mean, I've read his book. I've read Dr. Yasakari's book on the science of the Quran. An introduction to the science of the Quran, and he's pretty honest about this. He says, look, there is the Aruf, we don't have that, it's not known to us, we can only speculate what the Aruf is. And it's like, well, cool, I think therefore it is appropriate for non-Muslims and Muslims alike to say, therefore we have lost a significant part of the Quran. in the same sense, if I said to you, Rob, David, if I said, I have, I don't know, a collection of magazines or something, and I tell you there's like 20 of them, and you ask me to identify them, and I cannot do that to you. I cannot actually tell you what they are. I can't list them. I can't like point out the different contents of them. I simply have to tell you, look, that it really is the case that there are 20. At some point, you're just going to say, look, Chris, I don't think you do have 20 magazines. I don't think you have however many you think you have, because it's evident that it looks like you only have one, because that's the only thing that's preserved through the text, through the Uthmanic text. It's just the Uthmanic tradition, that one codicy that all the Qurans that we have today go back to, apart from the differing companion variant stuff. But
okay, Chris, if you can, for the audience, just for the sake, like I'm asking you to do something through the analogy of, say, Lord of the Rings. So Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and then Amazon's Lord of the Rings versus the original Tolkien work. Right? So in this argumentation you're making, so we have an original Quran, which would be Tolkien's original Lord of the Rings. Now, where would Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings be? Because don't forget, see, it's a transition, right? As we know, it's his interpretation, so to speak. And then Amazon is a big abomination. But either way, try and bridge that somehow with these terms like Ahruf and, you know. So the original Quran that Muhammad is directly speaking is Tolkien himself with his, you know, story. Where would Peter Jackson's version be in that trajectory?
I'm tempted to say like Abdullah ibn Masud's codex or something. Like it would be something very like obscure and odd and quite not as anywhere near as good. I mean, keep in mind there are difficult, like just think about this, like Muslims and Christians and non-Muslims that are watching. What we're being asked to accept is that Muhammad was told the same kind of thing in 7 different modes. And he memorized all of those different modes 7 times. And he had, like during Ramadan, he would meet with Jibril, and Jibril would give the Quran recitation to him, starting from the beginning, going all the way to the end, near the end of his life. You would have to believe he did that times 7. Like, first of all, I find that to be very weird. And I also find that if this was such an important thing, do you not think you'd find it in the Quran corpus itself? Why is it we only find out about this in Hadith? Would it not? It just seems one of those weird things that Allah chose a very peculiar way of revealing his revelation through his prophet, and he decided never to mention it, like in the actual revelation. I mean, wouldn't it be incredibly useful for us if in that revelation it said, by the way, this Quran is made of 7 different modes. Do not forget them. Do not destroy them. They are all Quran. They are all recitation from Allah. But of course, we don't have that.
You've also just reminded me of a verse in the New Testament, Ephesians 3 verse 15. Paul says that God's wisdom is manifested through the church, and he uses a very rare Greek term. It's a term that is usually translated like the multifaceted wisdom, but English doesn't do justice to the Greek there. It's literally an object that every time you turn it, it's something new, and if you turn it again, it's something it never repeats. It's always it's paradoxical in that sense, that there's always something new. So at least in the early church, and in, you know, theologically speaking, we have a verse here that tells Christians that the church is the vehicle by means God's continuous wisdom continues to grow. There's always something new. And sure enough, you know, 2,000 years of church history has demonstrated that. So we have something in the New Testament that basically is that, but in what you're saying is there's no mention in the Quran about Allah's multifaceted approach to his so-called recitation, you know, the Quran. So
exactly, and it's also worth just to make this clear. Not all the companions knew about this, which again is strange, because you would think that if you're giving revelation from God to people, it would make sense that you that you clarify this and you say, look, okay, I'm going to tell you this in one mode, but keep in mind, guys, there's another 6 different modes you might hear me recite this in. So don't get confused and come to loggerheads and start getting into fights with each other because you hear different modes with different words, with different meanings. Don't worry about it. That would be the last thing I want. So I'm just going to tell you, companions, every time I give revelation, so you don't misunderstand me, there are 7 different ways I'm going to do this, not just one. And yet, that's not what he did. That wasn't a concern of his. In fact, it was only when they came to blows with each other that Muhammad had said, oh, by the way, guys, it's totally fine. This is one way of reciting the Quran, one mode. This is another mode of reciting the Quran. It's totally all good. You can recite in any of these 7 different ways. By the way, there are 7. I find that difficult. Like from understanding how this would have played out in history, I have a difficult time putting that together and understanding it in a way that makes sense. So this is actually about the Bismillah. Basically, there are differing accounts of how many verses there are in the Quran. And because there's differing accounts, you can very clearly say, well, look, if the scholars debate it, then the Quran is not perfectly preserved. Because if you don't know how many verses there are in the Quran explicitly, and there are differing accounts depending on how you understand where certain verses start and end, because that isn't clear. Because Muhammad would basically indicate the start and ending of a new verse by just a prolonged period of silence. So, for example, I could do this, and that's now a new verse. But of course, that's difficult, right? Like, if it's just a period of silence, people can do that for other reasons as well, right? Like for effect. Or they can just be taking a breath, catching their breath as they speak.
Or he's yawning.
Or he's yawning. Yeah, maybe he's tired one day. And some people who aren't paying attention, they just hear him take a break and they go, oh, that's the start of a new verse.
Muhammad, that's also part of the revelation. Record that.
Well, this is the thing. And if you go by hadith, Muslims through hadith ascribe to Muhammad have a very particular understanding of the benefits of certain verses. And of course, these are numbered. Like, so chapter Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, Ayah 100 and whatever. That particular verse that's being referred to there, it might be something like, well, whoever recites this has recited the equivalent of so much of the Quran, or whoever recites this, they will not be X, Y, and Z by jinns or something for a certain period of time. They have properties, but for you to know exactly what part of the text is being referred to there depends on where you put the verse separators, which is in debate. So it becomes somewhat problematic there. It's clear that in their tradition, there is not such a thing as perfect preservation. There can be a kind of preservation, but it certainly isn't perfect. So this brings us on to the Qira'at. So far I've been talking about the Aruf, and this is where things get even more interesting, because the Aruf actually comes from Muhammad, according to their tradition. Muhammad talked about the Aruf. Muhammad talked about how the Quran is being revealed in 7 different ways, 7 different modes. Great. We at least have some material that can be taken to Muhammad, according to their tradition, that at least they can cling on to, and at least we can say, all right, we can take that at face value. We can do that. But now we enter something new. This is the Qira'at. And the Qira'at, in effect, is different recitations. It's different recitations of the Quran, which is also a recitation. I, for the life of me, find that incredibly obscure, but let's go with it. So we have different recitations of the recitation, in which these are found very early on after Muhammad, and there are imams who are in masjids who are leading prayer, and they are giving particular verses, particular ayah, where there are known differences that are being recited in prayer in masjids differently in different parts of the Islamic Empire, with different words that have different meanings, and that change the meaning in some situations pretty drastically. Now, if I was talking about perfect preservation of a Quran, of a recitation, I would not expect to find all these other recitations with differences or variants, as we would probably say in a more academic sense. But that's exactly what we find. How interesting. How interesting that Muslims believe the Quran is perfectly preserved, but there are a ton of variants in their own recitations that different imams, people of knowledge, who are leading prayers in the masjid, are reciting. Something's gone wrong here. What's the resolution? Very simple. The Quran hasn't been perfectly preserved. There's always been verses in the Quran that have been under question about what the correct recitation is. Now, what many Muslims do is they would say, oh, you have this qira'at, right? And there are all these different variations, and we're going to go through some as well. So you guys know, and you guys are aware of what these differences are. They say, well, we have the aruf. Muhammad talked about the aruf, remember? 7 different modes. And then how Jibreel gave it to Muhammad in 7 different ways. Maybe the qira'at are just these different modes. Maybe they're just coming all the way back to these different modes, and that's what they are. And so it's okay, because Muhammad said this was the case. He said the Quran was revealed in 7 different modes. That's how he revealed it. So there is no issue. Here's a problem. Remember I said the aruf, no one knows exactly what it is. No one knows what these differences are. They have been lost to time. And because they've been lost to time, there is no way we can identify them to even be able to say with any confidence that the qira'at is part of the aruf, or there's any kind of relationship there. There isn't any relationship there. There's no evidence for any relationship there. What's worse is, well, hang on a second. We have 7 aruf, right? But how many qira'at do we have? Well, if you go close to the time of Muhammad, according to Yasakadi, one of the Muslim Ummah's favorite scholars at this point, it seems, he pointed out there was like 25 different ones. And he quotes early Muslim opinion on that. The quotes, yeah, there are known at least 25 different qira'at with differences. But wait, how can the 7 aruf be 25 different qira'at? No idea. But there will be some Muslims who will be adamant that this is the case, when evidently there is no evidence for this. It just seems to be explained with alternatives, vastly easier. This is just scribal errors. This is just over time translations or transmissions in a recitation, in a text, are taking on these different appearances in the Arabic, because the consonantal rasm is there, but the diacritical marks aren't there, and when they start to add them, some people add it differently. There is a very easy alternative to embrace that, from a scholarly perspective, I think is miles ahead. But in the Islamic paradigm, it cannot be said, because it means the Quran is not perfectly preserved, if they were to ever admit that. So they have these 25 different qira'ats with different things in them after Muhammad. Whoops, that's not good. But that's okay, because we have Ibn Mujahid. Ibn Mujahid comes in to save the day. Ibn Mujahid is a guy who comes in the 10th century, and he's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There are all these different qira'ats, all these people reciting the recitation differently. That can't work. Let's make it so there's only 7 of them. Now, he's basically picking and choosing, and a lot of people didn't like Ibn Mujahid at the time because they didn't agree with exactly the ones that he picked. Why pick those? Why not pick these others that are also very popular? Well, Ibn Mujahid says it's these 7, so we're going to go with these 7. And from that point onwards, in the Islamic world, that 7 qira'at, the 7 different ones, readings, recitations of the Quran that differ in significant ways, those are the ones that are canon. That is, in effect, the Quran, the 7 different recitations, because Ibn Mujahid said it was. Oof. Now, of course, there was other problems. He picked 7. Why did he pick 7? It's kind of confusing, right? Because the qira'at aren't the haruf. They're different things. But he's made it the same number as the haruf. So now you have this issue where people are pointing out to him, why have you done this? You've confused everyone. You have the 7 haruf, and then you've made it, all the different qira'ats, there's 25. Some accounts say more than that. You've made it down to 7. But it's not the same thing. They're 2 different things. Well, he liked the number 7, so he went with 7. But that's not the end of it, folks. And this is, again, gets even more complicated. We then end up with Al-Jazari. Al-Jazari is writing in the 15th century. So a long time away from here, right? And now he's saying, actually, there are 3 other qira'at that we need to include. Because the Quran is not just 7 qira'at, the Quran is now 10 qira'at. And we are going to expand the canon. So the Quran is not just 7 different recitations with variants that are meaningful. The Quran is now 10 different recitations that are variants that are meaningful. So now you would have to believe that the 7 Aruf have somehow survived Uthman, somehow, even though there's only one text, but okay. They then take on variants because of diacritical marks entered into the Arabic at a later point, and somehow they've been incorporated into this qira'at that has changed over time, some going into favor, some losing favor, some being very popular in certain regions, but others being popular in other regions. This is what you have to accept as a Muslim. And I don't think that amounts to perfect preservation. Now we have someone who's joined us. I'm going to add you to the stage. Saran, are you there? Can you hear me? You need to unmute, Saran. And also, could you tell me if you are a Muslim?
Wow, he wanted to be added real bad in the private chat, but now
Oh,
he got
did
his chance. He just
Oh, I'm sorry. I've been talking
Oh,
for a
no.
while. Oh, yeah, he just said, add me, add me, add me, add me, add me. The entire private chat is just add me
You add him
again and then again and again.
All right.
Okay, it looks like he's left, so.
All right,
Saran, if
Saran.
you want to join again, feel free. But do you guys have anything to add at this point?
No.
By which authority
Unless
are they able to include and exclude qira'at? Because from my understanding, that the popular narrative that they use is that the 10 are the mutawatan qira'at, because there's actually hundreds of qira'at, but only 10 are supposedly multiply attested.
You've just activated my trap card.
Oh,
1 second. Let me bring this up, because Marine Van Putten has very helpfully written an article on this, and we're going to take a look. So this is PhD NIX's blog. This is Marine Van Putten. He does some amazing scholarship in terms of the different readings, and one article that I particularly love is his article, and you can find this, by the way, by going onto his blog. And if you go to the September 2023 archive, you'll find this article. And let's just read it, see what he says. So keep in mind what David has just talked about. He's mentioned that Muslims will say that either the 7 or the 10 qira'at, they are mutawatir, they are tawatir, they are mass transmitted. In other words, they are so well known throughout the Islamic Empire by so many people that it is impossible that these are intentionally fabricated, or that people came up with them by accident, but rather they have a chain of transmission that is attested throughout all of the different stages, all the different people involved in that chain, that go all the way back to Muhammad, and therefore we can be confident Muhammad actually said this. That's the argument. But let's see what Marine Van Putten has to say about this. Now, he's going to be talking about tawatur, which is the mass transmission of the qira'at, according to Al-Jazari. Al-Jazari was the guy who expanded it from 7 to 10 in the 15th century. So one of the interesting parts of modern Islamic orthodoxy, is it large enough, by the way, guys? I'll zoom in for you, is the belief that the 10 canonical reading transmissions are transmitted by tawatur, mass transmission so massive that it is unthinkable that people could have agreed upon a lie. The requirement of tawatur doesn't really enter the Islamic discussion until rather late. Yes, this is a late doctrine that they established, like other things. And while it has become the dominant position, as late as the 15th century, people were still giving pushback against it. One of the people who pushed back against this is Al-Jazari from the 15th century, the very same person who wrote a definitive description of the 3 reading traditions after the 7, which are now considered canonical, the part of the canon. This is what the Quran is. It's now moved from 7 different readings with variants to 10 different readings with variants. He is seen as the canonizer of the 10. Ironically, the 10 are now widely held to be transmitted by tawatur, even though he himself emphatically and cogently denied this, not just for his 3 after the 10, but even for the 7. In other words, Al-Jazari, the guy who was an expert on the Qur'an, who expanded it from 7 to 10, did not believe that the 3 he was adding were mass transmitted, and he didn't believe that even the 7 that were already there at his time were mass transmitted. He thinks none of them are mass transmitted. Whoops. And what's interesting is Marine van Putten actually goes into some of his work. He translates it into English for us. And he actually shows us Al-Jazari's argument as to why he says, look, it can't be mass transmitted. Because he gives criteria for how we know a qira'ah is valid. Because remember, there are loads of qira'ah at this point. People are just coming up with totally bizarre and weird readings that no Muslim wants to hold to as being actually from Muhammad. So they need a criteria in place to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. If I said, hey, guess what, guys? Muhammad in Surah Al-Baqarah ayah 7 said that we should all, learn the hokey cokey and put your arms in, put your legs out, shake it all about. People are going to say, whoa, Chris, that doesn't sound like something that Muhammad said. In fact, I don't think that is a valid qira'at of the Quran, what you just said there about the hokey cokey. And this is how they came up with ways of trying to identify these weird qira'at and saying that's not canon, but these are canon. So we have these different pillars of valid recitation. Number 1, it follows the grammatical rules of Arabic, even if just in some aspect, which is probably quite crucial because many aspects of the Quran do not follow the Arabic grammatically correct. The Quran kind of comes up with its own rules about that, which is interesting, as even Dr. Yasser Qadhi notes. And that's probably why he appends it with, even if just in some aspect. Then Al-Jazari says, and follows one of the Uthmanic codices, even if it only permits it. So he's trying to expand this to include other things, right? First of all, he talks about the Uthmanic codices, plural. Why does he talk about the plural? Because there's many of them and they have different variants in them, like we mentioned before. Second of all, only if it, even if it only permits it. In other words, it's a possible reading that you can add to the text to get that recitation, even if the actual rasm doesn't have it. As long as you can add the diacritical marks in a way that would work, then we'll allow it. So even here, flexibility. And finally, is sound in its chain of transmission. So basically, in other words, it has some kind of chain that it may be ahad, but it goes back supposedly to Muhammad. But Marin actually calls that into question as well. This is valid recitation, which is not allowed to refute and not valid to be denied. Indeed, it is from among the 7 aruf. So he's claiming this is from the 7 aruf, even though there are tons of these, way more than 7, which the Quran was revealed by. And it's acceptable for people to follow it, whether it is from the 7 imams or the 10, or some other of them from among the accepted imams. And when one of these 3 pillars is lacking, it is dispatched of as weak, daif, which of course doesn't mean it's incorrect, which is also problematic, unusual, sad, or invalid, regardless of whether it is from the 7 or from among who is the greatest of them. Interesting how he puts regardless of whether it is from the 7 or among who is the greatest of them. Interesting. But as we can see here, he, according to Marine van Putten in this article, Al-Jazari did not agree that it had to be mutawatir, mass transmitted. Only a single chain, not mutawatir, not mass transmission. He called into question whether or not any of the 10 that he said were canon were mutawatir, were mass transmitted. I might just, I'm going to post a link to this in the chat because I absolutely love this stuff. And I think people should know about it. So just posted a link. You guys can go on that, check that out in your own time. Marine van Putten does really awesome work. So yeah, that's basically my response. I know that kind of went on a tangent, but you asked a very crucial question there, Dawood.
So even the person who expanded them didn't think that you had to be so stringent in how you basically judged if it was authentic or not.
Yep.
Nice.
Even he was like, if you go and read the article, it actually says that he used to have this opinion, but then he changed from the opinion, because what he basically realizes is that if you say everything is mutawatir, then you basically invalidate all the other criteria, because in the Islamic paradigm, mutawatir is like sacred. If something is demonstrated to be mutawatir, mass transmitted, it has to be from Muhammad. Otherwise, it makes no sense. So, if I said to you, I don't know, Muhammad went upstairs on a Friday, that's mutawatir. Well, then it doesn't matter if it's not in correct Arabic, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't come from the Uthmanic Codex, because it's so mass transmitted, it can't be fabricated. So it has to be from him. So by having that single criteria of mass transmission, you basically undermine all the other criteria. So then you have to deal with people like saying, hey, there's this weird transmission about Muhammad, I don't know, taking a bath on a Saturday night. This is apparently mutawatir, but it's in a really bad Arabic and it's not in the Uthmanic Codex. And of course, if you accept mutawatir, you would have to accept that. And Al-Jazari and even Ibn Mujahid had reservations about this. They're like, whoa, no. You don't say they're mutawatir, just say they meet these criteria.
Right.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Let's switch these back. Cool. Now, let's talk about the differences. Because, of course, I've been talking about how there are different recitations in the Arabic and how this demonstrates there are different Qur'ans. Now, so far, no Muslim has actually came up to deny or refute any of this. I would honestly suggest you all it's because there isn't a way to. Once you go so far into this, as an honest Muslim, as an honest scholar of Islam, you would have to accept that, yes, there are different Qur'ans. There's just no way of getting around that. There are different Qur'ans. They do have variants. They do change the meaning. And yes, Muhammad supposedly said them all. And yes, some of them do contradict. But let's go, don't just take my word for it. Let's go through some. Now, this is from a conversation I had with Dr. Fidel Soliman. He translated the Quran into English, but what was interesting with his translation, and he works for the Bridges Foundation, which is a Dawah institute in Cairo, in Egypt. He, as part of his Dawah, translated the Quran from Arabic into English, but he also included the variants, the Qira'at. He didn't just take Hafs, which is the most common Qira'at read today around the Islamic world. He went, no. I'm going to do it for all of them. And whenever there's known differences, I'm going to, in the footnotes, add what the alternatives are, what other Qira'at said that verse should have said. And I presented this, me and him had a conversation, and of course this is his bread and butter, so he brought up some examples. This is Surah 10, Ayah 16. Say, had Allah willed, I would not have read it to you, and he would not have informed you about it. That is in one Qira'at. Then there's another one, which again, these are all valid, these are all canonical, these are all accepted in Islam, these are all the Quran. A different one says, say, had Allah willed, I would not have read it to you, and he would have informed you about it. Now the brackets, that's not in the Arabic, so we can just ignore that for all intents and purposes. The difference is very clear. In the top one, there is the word not. In the bottom one, it's absent. We would call this a negation. If I were to say to you, I have climbed Mount Olympus or something, and then I said, I have not climbed Mount Olympus, I haven't climbed, just in case you're wondering, I have just negated what I just said. Those statements can't be true in the same sense at the same time, because they are, in a formal sense, a literal contradiction. Dawood is in this live chat. Dawood is not in this live chat. They can't both be true at the same time in the same sense. Now, I presented this to Dr. Fidel Soliman. And Fidel Soliman said to me, Chris, whoa. What you have to understand is that these are complementary. Yes, they are different in meaning. Yes, they are both variants of the Quran. They are in different qira'at, but they are complementary. So even though they say contradictory things, one says one thing, one says literally the negation of it, you can say them both because they both enhance the meaning. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make this clear to you. That doesn't change the fact that they are still contradictory. Just because you say they enhance the meaning doesn't change the fact that they contradict. It's a bit like if I add spice to a food, I've still added that spice, right? It doesn't matter if I tell you I've enhanced the flavor. It's irrelevant to the fact that that spice is still there. You know, it's like, yeah, okay, the spice is there, but it enhances in a way that enhances things. No. You can take a subjective understanding about the beauty of it all you want. The truth and the matter of the fact is, from a logical perspective, these are negatory statements. They both can't be true in the same sense. But this is present in the Quran. Rob, Dawood, do you have any comments so far?
Yeah, so I think the common way that they try to deal with this, even though it is a straightforward contradiction, is they will claim some sort of enhancing factor is being done by the variation. So what's happening here isn't two contradictory statements, but it's giving you a sort of window into the mind of Allah, where He could have possibly not told them and then told Muhammad not to tell them, but also He could have not told them and then told Muhammad to tell them, and therefore somehow that legitimizes the contradiction.
Yes. So, in effect, they would basically say, yeah, it's hypothetical. This is Allah hypothetically giving a contradiction. This, therefore, is fine, because for some reason, in the Islamic paradigm, all of a sudden, which tends to be very strict about their understanding of contradictions, they have now entered a new category of allowed contradictions, which apparently is a thing, but hypothetical contradictions are fine. No problem. Just so you know,
deceivers. It's all good, man.
Indeed. Just so you know, Muslims, simply adding the word hypothetical in front of something doesn't change what it is. Like, if I have a red laptop and a blue laptop, I still have a laptop. You haven't done anything to change that. You're just trying to append things to it to make it sound less dramatic and less concerning than it really ought to be if you think the Quran is perfectly preserved. Because if the Quran is perfectly preserved, why do we have these contradictory verses in the Quran, in the Qur'at? Why? The answer, I think, can be best explained by saying there were scribal errors that were introduced over a period of time, and the Islamic world chose to incorporate these into its corpus, into its understanding of what the Quran is, in order to solve these issues in a diplomatic way that didn't involve going to war with different Muslim regions over which region had the correct Quran. And this is basically when the Quran changed from there's one version of it to there's now many versions of it.
And interestingly, often when you enter discourse with Muslims, they'll do this game where they'll jump between we have preservation of text, and then when you disprove that, well, we also have preservation of recitation. However, if the recitation is perfected, then how do these textual variants creep in? Because surely the recitation, the example they give where if you're standing shoulder to shoulder with somebody in a mosque and then the imam says a singular word that is off, somebody in the back will correct him. Well, why is nobody, for example, if you were to read like a Harry Potter and then you saw a spelling mistake inside, you would be able to point it out because you're aware of the story and how it should go, right? Or whatever the case would be. So, assuming there were millions of Hafiz running around, and then these changes would be introduced later, surely one of them would have said, "Wait a second, this isn't right." But that doesn't appear to happen. Yeah. It appears that the text wins out over the recitation every time, which is why even when Uthman orders the recension, I brought this up to somebody when I was speaking with them. If the problem was simply a case of the people up in Iraq reciting the Quran incorrectly, what would have stopped Uthman from just sending reciters to go and teach them the correct recitation? Why would you fix the problem of recitation with text if the Quran is supposed to be primarily delivered orally?
Very good point. Very good point. I think their understanding of their own history.
Can I also
go on, Rob? Yeah.
Oh no, I was just gonna quickly say, on top of what David's saying, to use the analogy of if anyone here is familiar with the Wicked Bible, thou shalt kill. Basically, so thou shalt not kill versus thou shalt kill. Since the typo emerged, we know it's mechanical, and but imagine if Allah, in a very low-key like manner, is like, hey, that's also correct. Thou shalt
And then
not,
imagine if
and thou shalt.
people then were saying, well, actually, it just enhances the beauty of the verse. It just
Yeah.
complements them.
But Chris, here's the bit that I wanted to get to, because obviously you and I know with the Wicked Bible, it's an error. It's an error of
Yeah.
the mechanism that produced it, or the human, right? But then, if we were Muslims in this, don't forget they have this hard, deterministic sort of like predestination theology. No, Allah, at that exact moment, because he's all knowing, right? He's all wise, made it fail so that not is dropped to then read, So
Good
yeah,
example.
but like imagine if your theology is like that, then then the implications spill out, like things like terms like slave. We are literally slaves, whether we like it or not, to the whims of Allah at any given moment. Like, I mean, the Quran says he's happy to do this, he's happy to do that, just at the whims of whatever he wants. So he, in other words, the umbrella term and the sort of the term that I'm thinking about that defines all of this, he's just an arbitrary deity, completely arbitrary. If all of these variations are again different angles, despite their contradictions. So,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's very hard to see a rational understanding of the will of Allah from an Islamic paradigm. To me, it just seems so convoluted, so arbitrary. Ultimately, it's just ad hoc. Everything in Islam is just trying to patchwork something else. Their understanding of preservation is trying to, on the one hand,
abrogation, right?
Well, yeah, even abrogation.
One moment alcohol's okay, suddenly, oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Quran is a clear book. Well, apart from all the unclear verses, to me, abrogation is just an admittance of contradictions. That's what it is. As an understanding of a doctrine, it is, yes, we understand these contradict, but we have a formal way of understanding the contradictions. And then that's how you deal with Surah 4, Ayah 82, where it says that, hey, you would find in this book many contradictions if it wasn't from Allah. Well, you do. You just have a term for it. Abrogation is exactly that.
Oh, by the
way,
I'm going to correct myself. It's not thou shalt not kill. It's the
thou shalt commit adultery.
Yeah, that's the.
I looked it up.
But anyway, the point still stands. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't. I was thinking, wait, that was, and then I realized what you were talking about as you were explaining.
Yeah.
I do have some super chats, so I'm going to show these on screen. I apologize that we went on for so long before doing this. This is obviously a very heavy, very intense topic. There's a lot of things to cover, but hopefully this is edifying and useful both to the Christians and the non-Muslims and Muslims that are watching this video, because we have 200 people live at the moment, which is amazing. Out of those 200 people, not really any Muslims seem to want to come up and actually challenge any of this, which is kind of surprising. I mean, this is kind of a pretty heavy attack on their understanding of the Quran as being a perfectly preserved revelation. But if Muslims are happy for me to continue, then I will continue. But we have the super chat here. Is Quran even an Arabic word? That is a very good point. There are many words in the Arabic corpus that we know have roots that are not Arabic. They come from Syriac or some form of Aramaic, even Ethiopic, in the case of like Tawheed. Although even the word Tawheed isn't found in the Quran itself explicitly, but that is a very, very good point. We have Daniel Apologetics, Surah 2, 184. Hafs versus Wash difference is a biggie. I think I actually have this as an example, if it's what I'm thinking it is. So we will get to that shortly, Daniel. But nice one. It's always good to know that we as Christians, with our conversations with Muslims, we understand, hey, we know some verses. We know Quran, Surah 10, Ayah 16 is a direct contradiction. And just knowing that and being able to show that using the Bridges translation, which is something you can. I might put actually, Dawood or Rob, whichever one of you can do it first. Could you get a link to Dr. Fidel Soliman's Bridges translation of the 10 Qira'at of the Noble Quran? Could you get a link to
for
I
PDF?
I think
either the PDF or just to I don't know, the Google Play Store?
I don't.
I swear I already had
Ma-
this.
That's cool. No worries if you can't. I'll grab it up in a sec.
Okay, I'll look for it. I swear I had this before somewhere.
Well, what's it? Are we talking about 1016 here?
Yes.
No.
Oh wait. Well, I mean, as the example I got on screen, Daniel's given another one, and there's even more that we can go through as well. I just want to encourage people to get this book as a reference material, because when you're talking to Muslims and you want to quickly show them a Islamic verified, this is like a Dawah approved textbook in effect. You can bring this up and you can read it and you can say, look, here it is. Here's where even your own scholars say these contradict. That's why I think it's useful for people to have the Bridges translation of the 10 Qira'at of the Noble Quran. I think that's the name of the book. But anyway, we'll move on to more super chats.
Fidel.
Dr. Fidel
Suleiman.
Suleiman. Fidel Suleiman,
Yeah,
from the
yeah.
Bridges Foundation.
Yeah.
I
Maybe
have
just
the
a link to his
PDF.
website.
But not the. Is it available on his website just to view?
I think you do have to buy it. I think it is behind a paywall.
All right. Well,
Because I think I did actually buy it because I was like,
Well,
hey,
I'm
I just go
accessing it. I'm accessing it through my academic institute, so
oh, nice.
I'll get it up for you guys in a moment.
Cool. All right, so we have Patriotic Z who says Rob Christian proves Quran isn't perfect Arabic, and a lot of it is Aramaic. Even Quran is Aramaic, just like Injil is from Greek. That is a very good point. You know what's funny? Dr. Yasser Qadi has a way of explaining this. You know, I told you I read his book, An Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran. He mentions this, and he basically says a good way of solving this, because he acknowledges it is a real problem, is just to say that the Quran, when it came down, just magically transformed these words into Arabic. So basically, the Quran is just like some kind of like authority that just goes, boom, you know, we're here now. This word is now Arabic. Like it or not, it is. It wasn't Arabic before, but now it is Arabic. Now the Quran has come down.
It's like a divine trademark.
Yeah, copyright. Like the Quran copyrighted it, I guess.
That's mine.
Let's make it even more humorous since we are in chapter 10, right? So imagine the three of us time travel to Muhammad. All right. And this chapter is named after a certain biblical person. That's a trivia question. What's the person's name? Surah 10.
Is it Surah Yunus?
Abraham? I don't know. Joseph?
Nope.
Oh, I don't know.
It's Jonah.
Yeah.
Right?
I was going to say, what does Yunus translate to? I'm pretty sure.
Yunus. Okay, now notice this. Yunus is the Arabic of the Septuagint's transliteration of the Hebrew Jonah. So hang on. So if I go to Muhammad, I'm like, hey Muhammad, do you know the story of Jonah? He'd be like, what are you talking about? Who's Jonah? But then if I use the Greek Septuagint transliteration of the word Jonah in Greek, and I said Yunus, then he'll know what I'm talking about. But the fact of the matter is, Yunus is not like, so if you and I went to Jonah and we said, hey Yunus, Jonah will be looking at us going, no, my name's Jonah, not Yunus. but Allah thinks that Jonah is Greek. Like Jonah's name is the Greek Yunus, not realizing that it's the Septuagint translator transferring the story into Greek that made, like, it's like Jesus. Jesus comes from the Latinization back into all the way back to Aramaic Yeshua, right? Yeshua is not Jesus phonetically, but etymologically it's the same. But Allah thinks that Yunus is literally the name that Jonah would have phonetically used for himself. Like, Anyway,
Yeah,
that's another little.
it's
If you think about it,
Actually,
like
that's a good point you bring up because it does sort of like have you like direct more credence to the idea that Muhammad would have been far more familiar with Greek than you would think he would have. So I think like Sig brought this up in a previous stream, but the document he was referring to is something called PERF 558. So it's a basically a dual language inscription, Greek and Arabic, that's dated to 643, and it's not something like very you think, oh wait, a dual language manuscript, then there must be like signing a peace treaty or like joining in marriage two very important people. It's just people trading sheep. So
hmm,
the point that Sig raised is if you would find a contract for something as mundane as trading sheep in Greek and the equivalent in Arabic, then very clearly the Arabs who were the ones being the beneficiary of the receiving the sheeps from the Greeks, right, would have been in contact with these Greek-speaking people, and it would have behooved them in some sense to know what the Greek of the contract said, just in case the deal went sour. So somewhere like Muhammad wouldn't have been monolingual; he would have known some Greek.
mhm.
yeah, I think it's really. This is one of those things that Sig brought to my attention, and I looked at it briefly, but I thought I'm going to look into this more because there's a lot of meat to be derived from that. But it's like an open tab on my browser that I need to go back to at some point. But yeah, that is fascinating, isn't it? We have
Mhm.
Greek and Arabic being dated to the 7th century. I think it is 7th century, right? It's like
Yes, 643 is the date given for it.
643.
Yeah.
Man,
Yeah.
that happened. That is dated before Uthman made his own Quran.
Mhm.
That's very early. Interesting. Okay, cool. So, oh yeah, we were going with super chats. Almost forgot.
And
So we have another
I'm
one.
about to. So the Bridges translation is nearly downloaded, but let me know when you want me to pull it up, and I'll pull it up. So
It's cool. I can get it here, I think.
Okay.
Actually, yeah, I'll do that in a second. Just one sec. So we have Patriotic Z again saying scholars didn't think they complemented each other. I guess this is in when you were talking about the Arabic, the fact that the Quran it contains words that are Aramaic and also have their roots founded in Greek, like in Geolis, for example. Yeah, it's pretty bad. We have Heroes Workshop, who said the total number of differences between the Hafs and Wash recitations of the Quran is estimated to be around 1,300. Yeah, and there are some of those.
Wow.
Yeah, and there are some of those that are significant. They change the actual meaning, and when that happens, you need to really think about what this means for your theology. How can the Quran be perfectly preserved if there are contradictory, differing meanings being ascribed to the same surah and the same verse? Thank you very much, guys, for the super chats. Greatly appreciated. Oh, I'm going to quickly share, because I do have a copy of this, which I think I can bring up. Let me just check. Cool. Can you guys see this? This is a PDF copy that I have. I bought this, I think, from his website, and you guys can do the same. So this is actually another variant here, which is quite significant. This is in Surah 17, Ayah 102. You see how he's highlighted this in red? Well, that's because there's a variant here. It says, he said, you have most surely known. Now, if you go down to the footnotes, a different reader of the Qur'an read it as, I have most surely known. Well, hang on a second. Who's speaking? One says you, one says I. That's a reference to two different people. That's called an indexical change. So we have, if I said I went to the shops and I said you went to the shops, they are very different, right? Because who I'm referring to changes. And so likewise here with the context of the verse. So again, another substantial, significant difference. And of course, this is also... Go on, Darrell.
I could see them saying something like, oh, well, it's referring to actually only one person from two perspectives. So if the word you is used, then this is from Allah's perspective. But if the word I is used, it's from Muhammad's perspective.
You know what's interesting? This is like recording supposedly an actual thing that was said in
Yeah.
history. This is a historic account, right? Like Muslims would believe that this was actually uttered, and these words are actually reflective of what someone really said. Although I think Fidel Suleiman doesn't actually hold that opinion precisely because of this problem. But if you think this was actually said, then you need to explain why some people think that I was said and some people think you was said, referring to different people. That makes no sense if this is talking about an actual historic event. Unless you think the same event played out twice with the same actors having the same conversation in the same time, in the same place, but then they just say, one of them just says the same thing but with a different word.
It could have just been like a nervous recitation. It could like I mean you. I mean I no I. No, it was
It's
you.
just it's stuttering between the two words, maybe. I'm not sure. But either way, the possible explanations of this, I think, are bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. So when we look at this, I'm going to take you guys just to the top. I'm going to show you the header of this so you guys can see what it is. This is what it looks like. This is the British translation of the 10 Qur'an of the Noble Quran by Fidel Suleiman. I very much endorse this work because it is a very useful way to easily show the different variants to Muslims. And it comes from someone who is from a Dawah Institute, a respected Dawah Institute, who even lists the people he had on his team when he actually mentions how the translation was done. And for that reason, it's also available as part of an app for your phone. Whether you have Android or iOS, you can download the app and open it up, use it when you have conversations with Muslims. It's incredibly useful. He also talks in his introduction about exactly how much of the Qur'an is variance in meaning, and he actually gives a very high number, actually, which other Muslims have disputed, and I'm not sure how he gets the number, but he gives a very high number. I think he gives like I think it's maybe like 30% or something is a difference in meaning, which is quite substantial. But yes, let's return back to this. So here's another classic example. This is Surah 37, Ayah 12. I again brought this up with Fidel Suleiman when I had my live stream with him, and he shows the Arabic, and you can see the ending is slightly different in the Arabic there, which produces the
man, you actually had him on. That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It was very interesting because he couldn't really give much of an account to these other than he would just say they are absolutely complementary, even though he acknowledges they are different. He acknowledges the Arabic is different. They are variants. He just thinks they're complementary variants. So with the different Arabic, and he shows it on screen and he highlights the actual word in question, and then he translates it for us. Rather, you were amazed as they ridicule, and rather, I gravely noticed they ridicule. Now, I've heard that this is actually a very poor translation from Fidel Suleiman because this is actually a very contentious passage. This is in the context of I would be Allah speaking. So if you think of it in that sense, and if you translated it as you were amazed as they ridicule, or I was amazed as they ridicule, you would have to think that this passage is saying that Allah was amazed at something, which would imply that he was surprised or he was somehow caught off guard. And in Islamic theology, this is quite a contentious idea. So instead, he translates it into the English as I gravely noted to sort of loosen that a little bit. But that's contentious, but I granted it when we had a conversation. But notice again, these are differences. They are indexical differences. Who is speaking? Rather, you were amazed or I was amazed. I in this context is Allah. You is human beings. Human beings and Allah are totally different beings. They cannot be reconciled. You guys have any thoughts on this one?
It's much the same as the previous one. The sort of like context switching. Who is the subject of the action that's taking place? Amazement, thought. Is it I, the speaker of the Quran, aka Allah Himself, or is it the person who is speaking to? Is it a prophet, or is it any of the other people who are mentioned within the Quran? The two of them. I mean, I think one way that they would try to rationalize this is, oh, they were both surprised. Okay, so you believe that your God gets surprised, that he moves from a state of expectation to one of shock because he wasn't aware of an action that's going to take place. Well, that's a
No,
whole other
David, you
theological
don't
problem for you.
understand. David,
Oh
it's
yeah.
just he gravely noted.
So
It was
your
just
God
gravely
notes
The
things
thing,
noted.
bravely.
Hmm.
Sounds very human.
just to clarify, because I've opened the page. Shall I share my
Mhm.
screen quickly?
Yeah, sure, if you
Uh,
want to see it.
all right, let me do that, just so that
Oh,
people
have
can
you
see
found
it.
it in the PDF?
Yeah.
Here we go. There we
So
go.
I'll zoom in some more.
Gravely noted.
So
Yeah.
it's up over here. Rather, you were amazed as blah 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 blah. Now he says here for footnote D before I get to G.
Mhm.
Hamza al-Kasai and Khalaf read it as, so it's their renditions. I gravely noted as they ridicule. So just to clarify, did I mishear you say that this Fidel dude, was the one that chose gravely, like
No,
himself?
I'm actually saying that I think Fidel has intentionally, in the English, rephrased it slightly because I've heard from other people who are more knowledgeable than I, and even other Muslims have said, no, it probably is you and I. That's the only difference here.
Ah,
Whereas
okay.
Fidel
But the
is aware
terms
of the
gravely noted
is not actually in the
is
Arabic,
it the words gravely noted.
to my understanding. Yeah.
Okay, because I'm just
So,
noticing that he's clarifying and saying that these individuals,
oh yes,
or
he's
whatever.
doing the translations
Yeah,
of the actual Qur'an themselves.
right.
These are the so the names that have been mentioned here, Hamza, Khalaf, so on. These are the names of Qira'at reciters whom this is traced back to, the different reciters.
Right,
So I
right,
think though,
right.
when he writes it in English and he's taking note of this variant, he's taking the opportunity to not say that Allah was amazed by translating it as
Hmm.
rather I was amazed as they ridicule, but he then changes it to gravely noted, and he does that for theological reasons.
Mm.
But
So,
basically, he doesn't want to
in that,
confuse English readers by thinking that Allah was amazed. I think
right.
I could be wrong, and I'm very, if Fidel wants to correct me on that, absolutely fine. This is what I've managed to find for my own studies, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So notice, so that's in that context of amazed. But then when it comes back to you, so when you come down now to a position G, as you're pointing out, right, the theological bias kicking in. So he goes, frequently the Quran addresses the events of the hereafter in the past tense. This grammatical shift should be pondered upon by the reader.
So to be fair to
This,
Fidel, what I do actually like is he does. So, for example, in the killer art, there are obviously, as Fidel is pointing out, and as I am saying, and as others have said, they do differ. They do differ in meaning in quite a few places. But a lot of the places, in fact, the majority of places, it's not actually a difference in meaning as such. It's a difference in tense, as an example. So one
okay.
killer art could be read in the past, one is in the present tense, so on and so forth. So he points this out and he tries to include this so he can kind of show the reader when you read an English translation, what you're basically doing is you're having it abstracted away from you. So you don't realize that there is this different tense that is present in the Arabic among the different reciters, among the different qira'at. So that's how that's what he's trying to convey
Sweet.
here, which I appreciate. Yeah. He also does. You remember, Rob? Remember when you noticed that ayah means like signs?
Mm-hmm.
Well, he also points this out. He also, in fact, he actually translates it as signs rather than verses because he wants to be consistent with that. So there are some things I like about the way he translates,
I
but
suppose. So in other words, it's oh boy. Now that can go into a whole other rabbit trail, like theologically, like you may
yeah,
have the exact same like I don't know, Surah 355 or whatever, like that's an ayah, that's a sign. But oh, there's a modified version of the same ayah, like, or
Can you
you
have
know,
a modified sign?
yeah, exactly,
sign.
yeah. So in other words, the classic
Ignore
a
that
wizard
one.
did it.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, go on, Rob.
no, I was just saying, like it comes back to the classic joke that we usually say in school. You know, a wizard did it. So like he'll do a sign or a miracle, whatever, like a magic trick, and then so that's like the 9 a.m. showing, right? Then the 1 p.m. showing is he has to repeat the same show, but with a slight variation because he can't exactly clone what he did at the 9 a.m. showing. Same thing with Elvis performing on stage. There's the Brazil live show versus the, I don't know, American live, like in his tour dates or whatever, right? Like it's still the same song. It's just there's a slight variation to it every now and then. So
In the
that's
context
Allah
of
for you,
the
right?
magician, in the context of the magician, there's also another analogy that you could play with. Eventually, people are gonna know how he does this particular trick, so it's gonna have to like abrogate it at some stage and then replace it with a new one. so
That's the 5 p.m. showing because suddenly he realizes, oops, I can do it much better this time.
yeah.
3 times a charm, right? 3rd time's a charm.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
You just made the mistake of saying the first time was perfect, and the second time, and the third time.
Now everyone's arguing about what actually is the magic trick. You know, what actually
Mhm.
is. I
And
mean,
then you see, this
different
is
interpretation of what it is.
this is why the jinn are not allowed to peep into heaven to see Allah's abrogation process because they'll start mocking him. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So here are a list of what I think to be some of the main differences. So because these are differences in the Qur'at, the different readings of the Quran, because the Quran has many variants that are canonized in Islam, these are the ones I think are most to the point, very clear cut, very hard to argue against, and most substantial. Now, people have different versions of these. Hatem Tash has her list, which is much bigger than mine. I actually stole a few of these from her, so thank you, Hatun. But these are the ones that I like to use. So 3712, the whole amazed, who was amazed thing. We went through that one before. 1016, did Allah inform them or not? Again, negation, direct contradiction there. 17102, who's speaking, Moses or Pharaoh? Again, an indexical change, changes the context. We then have
By the way, that's always
4381.
been my favorite one. The Moses Pharaoh
Yeah,
one.
the change in.
They were both speaking.
And they said the same thing at
Yeah.
the same time.
Because
in the same place.
they grew up in the same house, so you know they know each other.
They said it at the same time.
Yeah.
So
It's like that Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing at each other.
See, we just said it at the same time.
just pointing at each other. Yeah.
See, the Quran's been vindicated. It just happened.
So
Wait, did
another
you
one
just
we
bring
have
up the
here.
Spider-Man meme too?
Yes, I just did. I'm
Yeah.
pointing at the screen. But we
Anyway,
did it at the same time, so that's why. Well, watch it back. Watch it back later.
That was not planned, guys. That was not planned.
Great minds think alike, evidently. So Surah 4381. Now, this is where Allah uses a hypothetical. Allah does use hypotheticals in the Quran. And he says that if Allah had a son, Muhammad should worship him. But in the Qur'an, there are different readings. One says a son, one says multiple sons. Should you worship the son of God if he's just a son or if there's many of them? Well, it depends on the variant that you read. 1181 is a substantial one.
Hypothetically, Allah approves of what am I losing the word for worshiping multiple gods? Poly something.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be. If Allah had multiple sons, you should worship them, or Muhammad should worship them, according to the Quran.
So
which is a weird way of arguing.
Allah has kids. That's crazy.
Yeah, It's a weird, see, the thing is why would you bring a hypothetical up if there's no validity to it? Like, it's just a very weird thing, you know, because if you want to be absolutely clear, there absolutely is no way that Allah has a son. But if he did have a son, you should totally worship him. is
So
a weird way of
within the Quranic context, at least in one of the recitations of the Qur'ans, polytheism is hypothetically possible. Gotta love it. Gotta love it.
And if it turns out polytheism is true, you should totally do that.
Yeah,
according to the Quran.
that's very
you know,
interesting.
this sounds like as you wake up in the morning and you're doing a stretch and you're like, okay. I think I'll stick with sun singular for this morning, and then like a week later, you're like, all right, nah, I'll do with multiple plural.
Adding that
so-
S, add something to it, you know.
I mean, you could just explain this really basic as maybe Muhammad just had the fluidity in his speech to do this, you know? Maybe he just took liberty with this because he didn't see it as
Dude.
that much of a deal. I mean,
He
you know?
he totally beats Peter's Pentecost message. He can do all of this simultaneously in one. Yeah, sorry, I'm mocking over there. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, it gets difficult to think of how this is practical, and I struggle to see how this is practical. Now, so 1181 is very interesting because this is something that Marin Van Putten actually points out on his Twitter feed or X feed. He actually points out, look, there is a variant where the Quran in many places says that Lot's wife, if I remember correctly, I think it says that she went, I think, in many different places in the Quran, in different verses. But in this particular verse, there's a variant of it that says that she stayed. That, of course, is problematic because you can't both stay and go at the same time, no matter how many times Muslims will try and tell you, no, you see, she was kind of gonna go, but then she sort of stayed a bit, but then went, and I honestly don't know where you can think of it that way. She either stayed or she went, and the Quran is very clear in other parts, if I remember correctly, that she stayed. That she went. So why is there a potential Qur'an reading where it says otherwise? There shouldn't be, really. Just to be perfectly honest with you, given how clear the Quran is in other verses,
I'm going to
again
defend
and
the
again.
Quran here.
Oof, go on, Rob.
You ready?
Yeah.
The Quran is evidence, especially with Lot's situation with stay or go. The Quran is evidence for Schrodinger's paradox. You know, Schrodinger's cat is both dead
So
and alive.
We don't know if Lot's wife went
Quantum mechanic.
and stayed until you
Yes.
observe her.
So
So the
the
Quran,
Quran's affirming multiverse theory.
alhamdulillah, all
The
praise
multiverse
due
theory.
to the quantum mechanical nature of the Quran. That's just awesome.
If you said that each Qur'an is just a universe in the Marvel canon,
in the expansive Allah universe.
And guess
I mean,
who's
the
dictating it?
ACU.
Loki, as we
Ah.
understand according to the TV show, right? So
There's actually this is slightly off topic, but there's actually some odd like commonalities between what's in the Quran and then like what's like what like Germanic tribes believed about the gods or whatever the case is. Like I find it interesting that the Quran tells you that like one of the ways to like assure salvation is by fighting and dying in the cause of Allah, and then if you do that, He's gonna give you gardens where underneath which rivers flow or whatever. Sounds like Valhalla to me, but okay. Who promises you heaven if you die fighting for him? Odin does.
well, that's true. Yeah, interesting.
And then
Yeah.
the whole aspect of the
Especially
Trickster
with-
and yeah.
especially with the recent shock horror to all the MCU fans, Robert Downey Jr. acting as Doctor Doom,
Doom, yeah.
and it's like, wait, but he's Iron Man, he's Tony Stark. But then, I kid you not, apparently there was a recent comic that was released, and I'm not a comic nerd, by the way. I know this because of I've wanted to see their attempt to explain this, right? Apparently, there is a multiverse variation of Doctor Doom that is Tony Stark turned
I can
Doctor,
attest to this. It's
Doom.
true. Yeah.
Wow.
and then that variant then it has to compete with the other variants, right? So
you're saying the Marvel canon
but you see, but the
universe
moment
stuff makes more sense than the Aruf and the Kadat.
well, it's. I feel like the Aussie in me is kicking in, but it's. I was about to say BS. Like it's just one big convoluted, making up stuff as you go along. Well, for the Marvel situation, right? Because they're just trying to really milk the whole thing, right? But so I'm not saying that the Quran is doing that, although I do believe Muhammad is BSing all the way through. It's the followers that, when they're then compiling all this together, they are really making a joke out of it by, words dropping or words being included. And so, yeah. I mean, we're using these analogies to make the point of how ridiculous this sounds. So,
yeah, I would agree that. I think the standard Islamic narrative, I don't think can account for the structure of the Quran, the language of the Quran, the occasion of revelation supposedly of the Quran. Like none of these things I think can be properly accounted for in the standard Islamic narrative. And I think there are now better alternatives that are more probable. And I think that can be demonstrated academically.
And okay, so to be a little bit more formal, without being the Australian, to look at this without mocking it, let's just take it for what it is from an anthropological point of view. That such a phenomenon shows the finite, corruptible nature of the human condition, that humans make mistakes. The Quran, therefore, is a human work. It is an interesting piece of work, though, the fact that it's compiled the way it is, the stories that it preserves, as you and I have discussed, Chris, apocryphal legends, blah blah, and it's a thing. It's an artifact of history that has no, I believe, obviously, has no direct relevance to God or some sort of like inspired process. So all of this is to show, if you're looking at it through the lens of anthropology, welcome to how a small movement can become very cult-like and then suddenly explode into this.
Yeah.
This grand, kind of like Hitler and the Nazis. So yeah.
Interesting comparison.
I liked how he thought of it.
I'm being blunt as well.
You can't end with that. Actually, you can't. You give a very thorough explanation and be like, kind of like Hitler and the Nazis, and it just end.
Let's not make fun of it. Let's think of what it is.
But Hitler's story is like that. He started small.
It's like Hitler and the Nazis.
World War I soldier, and then it just grew into this bloodbath cult that caused the World War. Right. So it's just
So I would say I don't try to attribute to intentionality.
Sure,
I noticed
sure.
Isa,
it's on me. It's on me. Not on Chris. It's on me. Yeah.
I'm gonna add him to the chat. Hey, Isa, how you doing, man? I saw your message on the chat. I was like, oh, Isa. I was going to mention that you joined. It's pretty cool.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, good to have you again, man. How you doing?
I'm good, brother.
Good. So in this live stream, we're talking about the Quran and the way in which there are multiple recitations that can be called Quran that have variants in the way they are recited in the Arabic. And my claim would be that this demonstrates, you could perhaps say either one or two things. Either the Quran is not perfectly preserved in the way that we perhaps understand it today, or that the Quran is an umbrella term for many recitations that differ and contradict formally in some places. That's kind of my argument.
And I would guess, Issa, you don't hold to the idea of perfect preservation.
I don't.
I would assume.
And that's basically how you just go whoops and just avoid that entire problem. So yeah,
I think I think Muslims need to get the way that Christians do about, the Gospels, that it's like divine inspiration instead of like this perfect stuff. Because when you make a high standard that's falsifiable and you falsify it, then your whole castle crumbles. So it's like, it's just not a smart maneuver. And we have archaeology, we have academic ways of testing these types of things. So it's interesting. I'm actually doing a master's degree in Islamic studies right now. So we've actually talked about the Qira'at and the Ahruf. But the interesting thing is the standard narrative that you see a lot of people say is that the Qira'at and the Ahruf are just different ways of saying it. But there is other manuscripts that exist. And I think your argument that you bring up with the Caliph Uthman burning the other texts, I think it's something that needs to be investigated. And I think if we're going to use science and we're going to use history, we have to be honest with it. And it's interesting because I hear a lot of Muslims bring up and say, well, I believe in science, I believe in history. But when it comes to actually using science and history for these types of things, the whole thing just collapses. And they're like, oh, no, it's not real. Like, for example, if we say that there was, I know this is slightly off, but I think it's lined up. If we say that the Torah and the Injil are corrupted, that would mean that we could find an original Injil and a Torah. They would have to exist because we have archaeology. We can find manuscripts from thousands of years ago, right? That's how science works. So if we can do that, then we would be able to find this original manuscript. So taking this like kind of mythological position is not a smart thing. And this other position saying, well, it's perfectly preserved. I'm like, from what? You make the argument that it's an oral tradition. So if it's an oral tradition, how do you perfectly preserve an oral tradition? Well, it was put on leaf branches and sheep skins, and that proves preservation. I'm like, can we find that ancient sheepskin? Where's the sheepskin that we can see in the leaves that are there? They're not there. So it's the same. I think we have to be consistent and honest. So you can't attack Christianity and say, well, you don't have the original manuscript. I'm like, you don't have the original Quranic manuscript because there wasn't an original Quranic manuscript. So, sorry, I didn't mean to go on for so long, but I think that just is important.
That was good. Yeah,
just to build on that very quickly, last time we did a live stream, you asked a question, Issa, about what you thought the future of Islam would look like. And so the position that you just presented, I first heard this from, I'm guessing it's already like a well-known opinion among like the more, I guess like modernized thinkers within Islam. But Javed Hashmi has a very similar understanding that if you look at the Quran through the critical historical method, then you're going to have to, if you want to be honest, take it more as inspired text as opposed to direct divine text. So if you want to ask, well, I didn't answer last time, but in my personal opinion, that idea might become more widespread amongst like intellectuals and pseudo intellectuals. Will it whittle its way down to like common folk? Maybe not, but I think that is like going to be more of a pronounced opinion going forward, at least in the academic sphere. That was all.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think that's the correct way to that's an important situation of how to look at it. It's just, you're not these high standards that say, well, because I've heard people, like I've watched those little YouTube clips and they're like, well, the Quran is the only text that's always been perfectly preserved. And I'm like, have you studied all the other texts? Like, this is such an arrogant position. And I really don't like the position where people are like, well, the New Testament's corrupted. I'm like, have you read it? Like, it's pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing text. I'm like, do you really want to throw all of that away? And they say, well, it confirms if it's confirmed the Quran. I'm like, but the Quran doesn't talk about it. It doesn't talk about like Jesus's thoughts and his perspectives and the parables. It's not there. So I'm like, what are you saying?
Yeah, I think the fact like the Quran, the way it's structured isn't meant to be read in the same way that the Gospels, for example, are. They're quite different styles. So to think that the Quran can be sufficient is kind of a weird thing. Like the Quran doesn't even try to. The Quran doesn't go, right, okay, let's give an account of Isa's life, starting from the nativity to when he ascends. It doesn't attempt to do this, you know. So it's weird to think that anyone can think the Quran is sufficient alone in trying to gather what is true from previous texts, because the Quran just doesn't attempt to do it. And trying to force that into the Quran is a misreading, in my view.
And I think it's fair. It's just interesting that folks are like, we are this continuation of the text, but we don't want to actually engage the text and just say, well, the texts are false. I think that that's problematic, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree. So, in my mind, one of the issues, like the main point that I make in this argument, is that we have to have a very weird understanding of what the Quran actually is. So, if we want to think of, if we take the Islamic tradition, or at least Sunni, predominantly Islamic tradition, and we look at the Aruf and the idea that there were these 7 different modes that the Quran was recited in, we would have to accept that the Quran is basically an umbrella term. It is not a recitation. It is plural. It is many recitations that differ, that Muhammad supposedly said, and this can be retained, as in we have some way of knowing what these are, presumably through the Qur'at, and we can show this. And I think that that's just completely, you can't demonstrate that at all. That it just doesn't exist. There is no viable way of saying, right, we have a chain to be able to demonstrate that this particular variant in the Qur'at readers is from the Aruf. We know this for these reasons that go back to Muhammad, and we can be confident in this. I think that's completely absent. So from my paradigm, from my just looking at this critically, and I am obviously biased in some sense, I am a Christian who is critical of Islam generally, but I think even just a cursory understanding of this, people would have to say, well, there's multiple Qurans then. There has to be. Like, if there are these 10 Qur'at and they do differ, but they all are correct according to Sunni tradition, there are multiple Qurans in Arabic that go back to Muhammad. And I find it's interesting that you say that to Muslims and they'll be very, very careful to be like, whoa, hang on a second. There aren't multiple Qurans, there's only one Quran. But you just said there were 10 Qur'at that are different recitations of the Quran in Arabic that Muhammad said from Jibril. Yeah, but there's only one Quran. But wait, hang on. How does this work exactly? Either Quran is an umbrella term for all of these 10 recitations, or you have 10 different Arabic Qurans. And no matter when I start to unpack this out, Muslims will very quickly be like, no, we don't want to really engage with that. Let's talk about something different, because really they know it boils down to one of those two, and they don't want to pick one. But unfortunately, I think Muslims do have to pick one. If they do believe in these hadith, they do believe in the Aruf, and they do believe in the Qur'at, we'll go back to Muhammad. But I'm going to jump on to...
by the way, Chris,
That's fair.
that's perfectly stated, because I just want to quickly say something from the Christian perspective in relation to the New Testament. So what I'm just sharing my screen quickly, if you can share that.
yeah.
The difference here, though. Yep. So 2 things I'll share. This is a foreword by Dan Wallace in a 2018 book titled Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Textual Criticism, and Peter Gurry is one of the editors here, foreword by Wallace. So this is a very good introductory book to, textual critical issues. But notice what Wallace says over here. He says, the very worst Greek manuscript now in existence contains enough of the gospel in, now keyword, unadulterated form to lead the reader into the way of salvation. So even just take the worst in possession. Don't worry about the codices, and that is still, ironically, there's enough theology in there that goes back to Orthodox Christian ideas and beliefs. So I just want to quickly say that in relation to another work by a student who was under, guess who? Bart Ehrman himself. So she wrote her dissertation in 2014 that was then published, Oxford publication in 2016, under Bart Ehrman. She was a biology student. She worked in the field of cladistics, evolutionary biology. And being Christian, she had this like light bulb moment, like, what if I use cladistics with New Testament textual criticism? And that became, so I'll share my screen again, that became this work with a very fancy title, The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, New Testament Textual Criticism and the Biological Sciences. And that's a provocative photo there, but that's her name, Yil Yan Lin. So her argument is that take the Tree of Life, okay? Now, you have what's called the text types of the New Testament. Western text type, Eastern text type, Alexandrian, blah, blah, blah. That fits proportionally to the Great Commission. You have Western, towards a Western view, then the Eastern view, North, South as well. So the Byzantines to the east, for example, and if there is mutations relative to the geography of where these text types are, just like in evolution, you have a species that migrates here and there, here and there. You have evolutionary pressures and so on, and then you have splinter groups that go off, mutations that go off. Guess what? Just like in the Tree of Life and evolution, where you can reverse engineer back to a hypothetical Luca, the last universal common ancestor, that we're all interrelated with and shared with, right? You can do the same with even the worst, most modified, most like a text that may not be the original New Testament text, but nevertheless, you can bring that back, retroject it back to an original. How or why? How can you do that? Because of the variety and the what's called the embarrassment of riches, the fact that we have thousands and thousands and thousands of these manuscripts to work with, and the patristic witnesses as well. Now, is it true that Muslims have the same thing with the Quran? As far as I know, I don't think so. They can't do a cladistical, biological, using that as an analogy, to reverse engineer back to a Quran. So from what I'm understanding, what Chris is saying is, you have these 10 emerge, sort of like pop, 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 but there's no evolutionary connection to an original Quran, which in this case would be Muhammad. They're just like there in isolation, so to speak. But for Christians, we have this organic connection to an original. So, yeah.
Yeah. One thing I do want to clarify. Makes sense,
but yeah.
Yeah. Well, it brought something in my mind, which is that I do want to be clear. I do think it's fair to say that Muslims can argue for some sense of preservation. I mean, I think that's completely fair. The issue is that I think Muslims, particularly in the Dawah scene, and I'm talking in the last few decades, there has been this tendency to inflate this into some sort of argument. And to be honest with you, I think it largely comes about because of interactions between Muslims and Christians, predominantly, where Muslims are thinking, hang on a sec, you have this New Testament scholarship, you have biblical scholarship that is coming up with all these things and all these ideas and all these claims. We don't like that. We have an opportunity now, because we're not really in the light, so to speak, as much as the Christian scriptures are, to basically say that, well, our scriptures are so preserved, they have been preserved perfectly. There is not a single letter, a single word, a single dot that has changed. It all goes back to Muhammad. And I don't think this is what the early Muslims thought. I think this is something that is a later idea. And I think in particular, it was popularized in the last few decades by Ahmadiyya, Zakir Naik, and obviously you have Yasir Qadhi in some sense as well today. And I think that, to me, is a serious problem. Like, if I was a Muslim, I would be very annoyed by that. I'd be like, hang on a second, why do we have this tendency in our own scholarship, our own Islamic scholarship, to inflate things pointlessly, really, because this is not, again, what the early Muslims believed. It isn't necessary to even hold to this, but we're going to say it anyway because we want some kind of polemical argument that puts us one step above Christians. You know, like, oh, don't look at those Christians, look at their Bible and all XYZ and this textual scholarship in Bar Ehrman and all these scary things. Whereas we have perfectly preserved, trust me, bro, there is no there is no issue. What other Arabic Qurans? There's only one. Take it or leave it. That's kind of how I feel we have ended up in the modern day. I don't like that. I don't like people being lied to, because I do think ultimately there has to be some accountability for this idea, because it's very easily demonstrable that you can demonstrate this very quickly to be false. I mean, Yasakadi's book, it's like an introduction to the sciences of the Quran, very basic level. You pick it up, and even he's saying in there, yeah, there is this aruf, we don't know what it is. Here are some ideas. Take it or leave it. But then when it comes to more popular things, YouTube channels, lectures to popular audiences, anything that's broadcast on TV, then you start to hear funny perfect preservation claims being made.
I think your point, Rob, is actually quite interesting because you're right. I don't think from early Islam you're gonna have that, as you put it, the sort of like biological tracement back to like the original source material that then like diverges off into these different branches that still allow you to retain the identity of the original. And I think the reason behind that is whether intentionally or unintentionally, the early Muslims, at least according to the hadiths that we have, saw it as a strength to sort of like sanitize that tree, like down to a single cell that they viewed as being uncorruptible.
But just to clarify,
yeah,
not a single cell, more like a single clade
stem or
line.
Yeah.
And assuming that is a way you can get back to an original biological ancestor or something. The answer is no way. You need the whole tree.
You need exactly.
Yeah.
So it appears that they saw it as a strength, but in reality, it may not have panned out that way.
Nice. I'm going to quickly show some super chats because we have had a couple more. Inquisitive Mind. So Inquisitive Mind, the YouTube video that I showed earlier, where it was Marin Van Putten, and also a clip from Blogging Theology and the guy that you say was a flat earther on there. That clip was from this channel, Inquisitive Mind. He does amazing stuff. He finds different interviews, different videos where you have scholars giving their actual academic perspective on aspects to do with Islam, particularly in terms of the Quran. And he illustrates this. So if a scholar says something, then, that contradicts the standard Islamic narrative as we know it today, there is a very high likelihood it is recorded on Inquisitive Mind. So I would encourage you all to go and check out his channel. Some amazing stuff there. So he says, the Quran's inimitability claim can be met by ChatGPT 4. So yes, in my mind, inimitability is subjective in this context because the Quran doesn't define what that means. I don't think it's clearly given in any tradition, really, either the Sunnah or the Quran.
Produce a surah like this.
Yeah, produce a surah like it. Okay. Well, unless you give me criteria, that's subjective. And when criteria is introduced, you end up basically doing very bad things. Like you end up sort of putting the Quran in the category of actually it's not that great because you struggle to define exactly what it is about the Quran that makes it great. I think if you really wanted to keep this and to sort of like strongman this position, you would probably just say it's a mystery. It can't be known. It is somehow set apart in a way that is unidentifiable. But the issue even with that is the Quran uses it as a claim, as an actual challenge. So why make a challenge if it's like wrapped in mystery and can't be resolved in some meaningful way, in some objective way? That's the issue I have with this. So I think you're right. It is. Go on, Rob.
Just Chris, could you? Maybe it's a philosophical. I'm hitting a brick wall in my mind, but does this argument make any sense by Muslims? Oh, actually, no, it is in the Quran, isn't it? I mean, producers.
Yeah, it's one of the arguments the Quran makes for its own validity in a sense.
But I've tried, I've even asked Muslims to explain this logically to me. How does that make any sense? Like, for example, Einstein's field equations leads to this thing, and I'll use an equation everyone knows, E equals mc squared. without modifying the parameters. So produce an energy mass equivalence like it. So if I understand this argument correctly, it's like saying I need to come up with a novel, brand new thing that Einstein himself didn't think about. That will supersede equals mc squared.
I think it's even more complicated than that, because how do you even know that's the metric? Like, how do you even know?
You don't have any standard.
But that's
the issue. There is no standard.
That's why I'm hitting this, because I know for a fact that equal to mc squared is a fact. I can't suddenly just compete with it. No, it's a fact.
Well, and let's say you bring up another theorem. It's a different theorem, so it can't ever really be comparable. So you're correct. It's a. This is why I think the Quran should be looked at as a spiritual text. Like, the idea of trying to literally read it, it's a poetry text, and reading it, like, I feel it's a lot like akin to Shakespeare, like the sonnets and stuff. It fits more into that. The translators have never, what is it called? Preserve the style of the text. So what, like, a better preservation of style is Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat by Fitzgerald. He tries to actually preserve the style of the text. The Quran, I haven't seen a translator who's actually preserved the style of the text, because it's a poetic text. That's why you have lots of repetitions and things like that. I don't really think you can ever really meet the challenge, because you can always move the goalpost. You know what I mean? So I just, I don't see how you
but just
can
quickly,
do that.
who's moving the goalpost? Who
the
has
Muslims
the
are
arbiter?
doing.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna lie.
No, but is there the ultimate goalpost? Is it Allah himself going, you still, you haven't reached it? Like,
Isa, in a sense, if you take it as being majorly like poetic or spiritual, in a sense, could it be like I had a term in my head, I completely forgot. Come back to me. Sorry, come back to me.
I was just going to say, it seems to me like it would actually make more sense if the book did stop at Allah, because then at least there's some, like, hey, human beings, you don't have to come up with criteria, but because it is a challenge and they do say that they can have some standard for it, then it becomes bizarre. Because I mean, I went, gone to Speaker's Corner and asked people this, and you could just break it down. It's like, okay, so it has to be in Arabic, yes? Yes, it does. Okay, and it has to be verified by experts in Arabic, for example, right? Yes, it does. Okay, generally we agree on this. Is it better for the text to be verbose or brief? I don't know. The Quran has both. Like, so, okay, so it can't be that then. Is it better if it's poetry or an account of history? Well, the Quran has both, so I guess it can't be that either. So you could just keep going through all these different types of grammar and types of language and of different types of categories, and they can never tell you which one it is, because as soon as they commit to it, then it can be compared, and then it becomes problematic. If you say it's the verboseness of it, well, I can find you something that's in Arabic and even more verbose. If you say it's how brief it is, I can find you something else that's even more brief. You ends up them kind of accidentally arguing that the Quran is not the best of things if they go into that level of criteria. So they tend to simply say, well, it's the beauty of it. Well, okay, but beauty,
but
in what sense?
That's so ambiguous.
It's very ambiguous. To be fair, I do think there is an objectivity to beauty, but I would argue that that's very, I mean, it seems clear to me that I can think of alternatives. And I also think the qira'at is kind of a way of dealing with this, right? If there are different qira'ats, different recitations that are valid Quran, have they met the challenge? Because they had one variant, one qira'at, and then there's another one with a slightly different change that is just as beautiful, just as amazing. Does that met it? It seems weird. I mean,
is
then
there
of course you have to compare.
Is there a? Oh no, I was just going to say, is there a Klingon ayah? Produce a ayah like this Klingon language?
Could there be?
Has to be Arabic.
Or if someone is
I was going to ask. Sorry, so
high up in like a high
my head-
altitude, sort of helium-induced sort of voice box.
the word came out to my head.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
Is it so? Would you interpret it maybe as, again, given that your take on it is that it's spiritual and poetic? Could that challenge be like a rhetorical challenge, as in it's not supposed to have an answer to it? It's just supposed to speak to the magnificence of the text.
I think it's a valid interpretation. You know what I'm really impressed by? Is that Christian apologists seem to be better apologists for Islam than many of the Muslim apologists. You make better arguments than a lot of the Muslim like I hear the Muslim apologists like doing chest thumping and boasting and not really trying to engage the text and trying to be fair and having humility, but lots of ego stroking and arrogance, and it's like very unappealing. To someone like me, it's highly unappealing. I listen to it and I'm like, do you think you win with this? You have to have humility and you have to like step down a little bit. And then you make claims that you don't even have the skills or the qualification to deal with. Like, for example, Nadir Ahmed makes the argument that the Quran is scientific. I'm like, Nadir Ahmed, do you have credentials in science to make these claims? I'm like, you have to understand, like, I'm a community college scientist. That's my skill level in hard sciences. Most of my work is in social sciences, but in hard sciences, like even just reading a scientific textbook, you can't take a religious text and then have the most vagueness of the text and then say, well, this is comparable to science. I'm like, it's not. The Quran is not scientific. It does not show us embryology. Let's be honest with the text. And when you do it, you make yourself look bad and you make the community look bad. I'm just being honest here, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's completely fair.
But just quickly coming back to David's point about rhetoric, like that's an interesting way of putting it. It's like God going, "Can you produce a surah like it?" You know, with an open question mark. But then at the same time, what's the point? God is like, well, you know all things. You know, like that would be my response back. It's not like I'm going to compete with you. So,
it's kind of like in Job, where like Job is lamenting his experience, and then God just asks him all those questions that have no answer.
Where were you when I laid the foundation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Bring it all together.
So we have another super chat from Inquisitive Mind. Thank you, Inquisitive Mind. It says Quranic and pre-Islamic poetry variants are the same. Now, I happen to know what he's referring to here. In effect, there has been studies from, I think it's Dr. Shadi Nasser, I think, a paper that he's written. Could be wrong on that, could be someone else, but I'm just going from memory, where he demonstrates that when you look at pre-Islamic variants in poetry, and you contrast them with Quranic variants, they look very similar. In other words, when Muslims try to say that if you look at the different variants in the Qur'an and we can say, oh, well, this can be explained through a divine origin, you can very easily say, well, hang on a second, let's look at any pre-Islamic poetry that we have and check out for any variants in that and see if that kind of variant is similar to what we find in the Quran. And he demonstrated in his paper that, yes, there is an overlap in the types of variants that are found in pre-Islamic poetry and in Quran Qira'at variants, or alternative readings in the Quran. That is interesting, right? I'm thinking of maybe doing a video on this at some point. But, yeah.
You know, there's one other point I wanted to mention, too. Like, looking into these apologetics, I'm very unimpressed with Muslims' attacks on Christian and Jewish apologetics. Like, it's very, very unimpressive. It's very surface level, superficial stuff. Like saying, oh, you know, the characters are bad in the Tanakh. Look how terrible they are. Like, they did bad things. I'm like, have you read the Hadith? Like, I mean, it's like, it's not even comparable. Like, it's so bad. Like, if you go into the Hadith literature and you want to talk about Ma'sum, it's like you need to have humility in engaging this. And I think that's the only way you're going to have a real dialogue, is where you're like, hey, I have limitations. I have to be accountable. And that's how I need to come to the table. If you come with ego and hubris, it destroys yourself here, you know?
Yeah. I think there is, when you said that, to be honest, what actually came to my mind is the story of Al-Qaeda in Surah 18. Dawood, is it 18?
It's a Surah Al-Kahf. I think, right?
Right,
The
right.
cave.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one. Because he's just such a weird character. He's somewhat of a companion of Moses, and he's with Moses, and he's going through these things, and he's demonstrating to Moses that Moses doesn't have kind of the humility, I guess, to accept what he's doing without question, and that he will eventually reveal it. But Moses keeps questioning it because what he's doing is so interesting and kind of bizarre. I mean, he actually kills a child, right? At least
A young
in terms
boy.
of, and Moses is like, "Wait, what? what are you doing here?" And it's like, Moses, I told you, you wouldn't wait for me to do X and then reveal to you eventually. And then when he does it, he says, "Look, the reason why I did this is because there was a real risk that this child could cause disbelief to his parents, and have the parents presumably fall out of the
Wait,
fold of
what the
Islam."
heck? Is this in the Hadith?
In the Quran,
No,
Surah
it's his
18.
Quran.
Yeah.
It's Suratul Kahf. Yes, it's in the Quran. It's about. There's actually a movie called Circle of Iron
that's right.
from the
Oh my
80s,
gosh, I forgot about
where
that.
Bruce Lee kind of reinterprets the same story. But yeah, it's about
it's a really
spiritual
odd,
guide.
it's,
yeah.
Wait,
Yeah,
what?
no,
Hang on. Are you
that's
saying there's a
coming back.
Bruce Lee version of this story?
Yes, Circle of
Circle
Iron
of Iron.
with Carradine.
I want to see that.
Oh my days! I need to watch this.
Yeah,
Right.
it's a good movie. It's good. Yeah, I like 80s stuff, so it's good. I'll send it in the chat.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that's cool. I did not know this. But yeah, this is kind of the character that I find is weird. Just in the Quranic stories, this guy just stands out as, who is this guy? He's kind of like mysterious. He just comes in and just out of nowhere. Only explained it as far as I remember, just in Surah Kahf. He isn't mentioned anywhere else. Yeah, just weird.
Oh,
Sorry,
how about
late
the Samaritan?
Samaritan?
Yeah, remember the Al Samiri or Al Samir or whatever his name is?
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Samaritan.
So this is basically
Looking
when
around with Pharaoh
Moses-
Moses and yeah.
Yeah, when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai and they've made the calf, he yells at Aaron's like, "Yo, the hell!" And Aaron's like, "Oh, it wasn't me. It was the Samiri or whatever." And then I guess that's supposed to mean like the Samaritan. But the problem is Samaritans don't show up until way later when they're settled and then exiled, and then Samaritans mix with the
Like centuries later, we're talking
like who they mix
post-exilic
with?
period, like
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
They mix it with like a different group, and then they spawn from that point on. But then for
Yeah.
some reason, in the Quranic telling, it has the character all the way back when they first left Egypt. It's very, and then also it alleviates the blame from Aaron for being complicit in the making of the golden calf, which is interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think the Samiri is supposed to be Korach, right? Like it's supposed to be equivalent to Korach, right?
Is it? No, I heard it was supposed to be a Samaritan, but okay, potentially.
It could be a fusion of things. I wouldn't be shocked. Just being honest,
Just to say, Ibrahim, if you would like to come and discuss some of your claims about the Quran and Muhammad's miracles and predictions, prophecies, I would love to have you on, and I would happily engage you on that if you're bold enough to do so. The link is in the chat.
Fair enough.
we've had a good appetizer for 2 hours, so we need some action.
Yeah.
Come on.
I did want to ask
main
Issa
course
just
meal is-
one. Yeah, I did want to ask Issa his opinion on a matter. So it was when you were talking previously about when Chris mentioned poetry, how there's similarities in some pre-Islamic poetry to some of the variants you see in the Qur'ans. Obviously, this poetry would not be accessible to us today if it was not preserved by Muslims, because there's no reason why the art style wouldn't have been abandoned from the advent of Islam, or maybe they wouldn't have just been destroyed by like a ruler or something in some random year. So clearly they were preserved intentionally by Muslims. So with that in mind, do you find it interesting, and I have my own conclusion on this, but I want to know what yours is. Do you find it interesting that there doesn't seem to have ever been any efforts made by any Muslim to preserve the Torah and the Injil? I have my
That's a
reasons
very-
why I think that, but just out of curiosity, what do you think? That the poetry could not have survived had it not been for the Muslims. But then the Torah and the Injil weren't preserved by the Muslims, even though they know it's from Allah.
And even though the Injil was written by Muhammad's family, if you accept that Warqa bin Nawfal
Yeah.
was actually writing down the Gospels, which is weird.
To answer your question, I think that the original folks believed that the Torah and the Injil were preserved. And I think it's very,
yes.
I think
That's
it's
what I think.
weird when I keep hearing that this is a new thing for me, honestly, coming into the apologetics. I've always said, yeah, these are the true texts. The Baha'i take that same position. You know, the
Mhm.
Baha'i, the way that the Baha'i look at the Quran, they say, well, it's a spiritually inspired text and it has validity, and they see it the same way that they see the Torah and the Injil. That's the way that they look at it, and it's surprising. I think the Muslims kind of originally were sort of like the Baha'i and saw, you know, the Torah and the Injil just that way. It's like these are holy texts and you revere them. You may not read them, but you revere
Yeah.
them. You know what I
And they're
mean?
not binding on us, but on those guys who we accept as being part of our tradition, but they have their own text. This stuff is for us to adhere by.
Exactly. And I think that is a better Islamic apologetic than this position that it's corrupted and then mocking it and making fun of it. And I'm like, you do realize when you take that position, you take it all the way to its fruition, you're mocking God. If you say that these texts are from God and you say, well, they're not really from God, then you're saying that God, again, like I said last time, your
Mhm.
God is a deceiver or God is weak. Like any position you take, it's so bad and terrible theologically speaking, you're going to lose. You're going to lose if you take the position that these texts are corrupted. It's a lose-lose situation. All it looks like is like a small win. You have this tiny little win that you're like, oh, I won the argument, but you've lost the war. You won the battle, you lost the war. So it's a very bad position, in my opinion. And I'm actually writing a paper against Tahrif. I'm arguing against the Tahrif position at my school. That's going to be my final paper for one of my classes, because I'm like, this Tahrif position is very bad, it's very stupid, and it needs to be abandoned quickly.
If you when you write that, I would love to read it. If you want to send it my way once you've
I'd love to.
done it.
I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like John Fontaine is supposedly writing a book with his perspective on the Islamic dilemma, trying to solve it. So as soon as he finishes that, I'm going to buy his book, and then I'm going to read his book, and then I'm going to write about his book. So I'm just going to get
in response to John.
because I was like, well, I've invested so much of my time reading into this. I feel as if I probably should be the guy that reads his book and responds.
To be honest,
so...
I'm surprised. To be honest, I'm surprised he even has the time to write the book, considering he boasts to me that he has multiple women married to.
Oh, really?
Like he mocked me for saying, like, Rob, are you married? And
oh, wait, we have Ibrahim.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. When they do that, though, that's horrible. Like the fact that they actually think it's acceptable to do that. Anyway, hello, Ibrahim. I assume you're the same Ibrahim who has been in the chat. Is that right?
Yeah, I am. I was just wondering, like, who do you think, came up with like the Quran? Because I mean, when I read the Quran, I can't help but think that it couldn't have come from anyone other than God, because of like the sign. Because the Prophet ﷺ, he couldn't, as you know, like he lived in the 7th century Arabia. Like, where he have gotten access to, like, all those, like, stories of like the previous prophets, because he lived in Makkah. The Quran is divided into 2 phases. So like, where do you, like, why
sure.
what mode?
I'll give you my opinion. So first of all, okay, I'm not actually sure if I accept the division between the Meccan and the Medinan period. I try to give a courteous view, and I say something like, Muhammad may have had family in Mecca, maybe he originated in Mecca, but I think realistically he probably moved from there at some point in his life further north. That best explains how he knew of these stories, because these stories are much better known further north. But even then, I don't think that's necessary to think that. You could actually hold to the standard perspective and say, well, actually, at this point in the Hijaz, maybe there were these oral stories being told about Musa, about Ibrahim, about Yusuf, about all these different people. Maybe these stories were just well known. I think that's perfectly reasonable. So you said that you think the Quran, it clearly comes from divine origin. The issue I
Yeah.
have with that, let's just take one example, just real quickly. In 29 of the surahs, they open with mysterious Arabic letters that no one knows the meaning of.
Yeah, I'm aware. Yeah, those
Okay.
I think those letters are not. I think it's similar to, like, in the Quran. It says that there are some verses which are ambiguous and some verses which are clear. I don't know if there's
Oh,
any
sure.
connection. Yeah.
Oh, well, that's fine to have that, but you notice that ambiguous is totally different from completely unknown.
Oh yeah.
This isn't like there's like 3 possible things it could mean in all these 29 different surahs. Rather, no one knows what they mean. In fact, it's actually debated what kind of thing this is. Like, is this? I mean, some people have. The secular view, or the perhaps more academic view, is perhaps this is some sort of sign from the person who was reciting this. Perhaps they had their own signature or some way of referring to themselves. But you could stick within the Islamic paradigm and say, maybe this is just a way of referring to different tribes in Arabia at the time. Maybe this is just some of Allah's attributes, some of Allah's names that are being pronounced. But the issue is no one even knows the kind of thing this is referring to, let alone specifically what it translates into.
But what motivation would the Prophet have for starting Islam? Because if you do know that prior to receiving revelation, he was well liked. People would call him like the trustworthy. So, like, what motivation would he have to, start preaching Islam and being persecuted and having to be uprooted from Makkah,
Sure.
to Medina, and why go
Yeah.
through so much hardship for a lie? Like,
So I don't necessarily think you have to commit yourself to think it's a lie. I think it's a bit. I see Muslim apologists try this, like, either he's truthful or he's lying kind of approach, and I don't think that's an accurate paradigm. It's perfectly reasonable to think that he was convinced he was a prophet. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of looking at this data. Now, again, I'm assuming there is a Muhammad, that at least one Muhammad, because again, Muhammad as a title is ambiguous because we see it in other sources refer to different people at the time and before Muhammad. But ignoring that, say there is a Muhammad, say he is in Mecca, and the standard Islamic narrative is correct. It's perfectly reasonable to think that perhaps he was convinced. I mean, you're aware of the Oriental ideas in the 19th and 20th century. They were arguing that perhaps he had some form of epilepsy, and that best explains the occasion of his revelation. Obviously, this is from a secular point of view.
yeah, but I mean, if he did, I mean, if that was the case, then why is the Quran, like, Islam is such an all-encompassing religion? It encompasses everything of every aspect of a person's life, from the way he eats, the way he dressed, the way he sleeps. Like, it gives a legal code, in terms of legal punishments, like inheritance. It encompasses, for crime,
A
etc.
certain
It gives you the
type
guideline for running a society.
of
So
all of those
if the
things.
Prophet,
It's not
had
universal.
epilepsy, then how could he have come up with such a, you could say, like, a revolutionary, sense of, how could, like, he have come up with a religion that could define, or that could build a society? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, you would have to ask that same question to every other single religious leader, right? So, Zarathustra, you could
Joseph
talk
Smith.
about Joseph Smith. You could go through all these different leaders, and they were successful. I mean, Mormonism, there are millions of adherents to Mormonism.
Yeah.
Does that prove it's valid in some sense? No, of course not. We always know that sincere meaning people can err, and that does include in the context of religion. We all believe that because we're all theists that deny some of the religions, right? Like, I'm a Christian, I deny Islam. You're a Muslim, presumably, you deny Christianity.
I'm a Muslim, yeah.
So, for example, if I said to you, why is it that in terms of looking at the world historically and currently, Christianity seems to be doing the best in terms of a large, broad amount of metrics? We could say economic wealth. We could say in terms of spirituality, number of churches. We could say academic success. We could say creative studies. We could look at films produced, inventions. We could list a long list of metrics. And I could just say, oh, well, this is Christianity. This is proof Christianity is true. But you wouldn't accept that. Right?
Yeah, okay.
Right. So just because something has led to some success doesn't mean it's true. And we wouldn't argue that way.
Okay.
For example, if all the Christians died in some...
Oh.
Go on, Rob.
No, I was just going to quickly say a recent phenomenon would be, say, Star Wars. I mean, it's become a cult-like following, pretty crazy. It was a simple 1970s, sci-fi flick that was sort of inspired from Dune, a more serious version of what Star Wars was meant to be. And then it became this massive phenomenon. Like it's become practically a religion now, like Jediism, for example.
It is a religion.
And Chris
And Star
mentioned
Trek too.
Joseph Smith. Yeah, so Chris brought up Joseph Smith. Same argumentations Mormons use for Joseph Smith. He was honest. He was uneducated. He apparently stumbled across these golden tablets in what's called Reformed Egyptian. He was told to, guess what, recite it. He couldn't recite it. So what he used was a certain tool, a magician's hat, to have this Reformed Egyptian mystery letters transform into, guess what, Old English, King James English, which then he recites to his scribe to then write down, and that became the Book of Mormon. Oh, but then the scribe or something happened with that original copy, so he had to redo it again, which means the second attempt is obviously a little bit different to the first attempt. You can see where this is going, right? And then he did the whole polygamy thing, like you can have multiple wives if you want, and the movement just spread like wildfire in America. It was like an American phenomenon. Same thing with 7th century Arabia. It's an Arabian phenomenon that just went out for Islam. So anyway,
yeah. Also, like, what about like I've heard like this, like this scientific theory. I'm not really a huge like proponent of that, but what about like the
Ibrahim, if I could, right? It seems that you bring up something, an answer is given, and then you just don't even bother interacting with the answer. You just sort of move on to the next thing.
I don't find those answers convincing because, like, I mean, the Quran
could you push back on it, maybe?
I don't know. Like, for example, like, the Quran mentions like the expansion of the universe. Like, I mean, the Quran.
But you moved on to a different point. Beforehand, you were talking about how influential Islam's been, and then Rob and Chris gave you like the reasons why simple influence isn't like concurrent with it being from God, because there are many influential things that aren't from God in a direct sense. So what do you think about that? Instead of just jumping over to something else.
And just quickly, I want to clarify to Ibrahim with the way Chris is answering the questions. Ibrahim, I'm trying to model. So David here is coming from a sincere place. What he's technically trying to say in regards to what Chris and I are saying is the questions you raise, immediately you have these blind assumptions. Take a step back and literally critically criticize your own question and think, do I have any blind spots in these statements? So, for example, when you say things like, but he's this illiterate guy, ergo, it's a miracle that the Quran exists. No, that's a quantum. You've immediately jumped assuming just because he's illiterate, ergo the Quran is a divine. You can't make that leap. The point is, okay, let's just say he's illiterate, and then we analyze the Quran. But then the Quran is found wanting in a lot of the stories that it does speak about in regards to history in general. So then we are just left with, well, it's like the blind leading the blind. We have a genuine illiterate guy and false stories in the Quran, but it's a miracle anyway that he was able to regurgitate false stories anyway. Like, do you try and see where I'm coming from and where Chris is coming from like
I think
a self-critical analysis of the statements that you're making?
Yeah, but my quandary is that where would he have gotten access to those stories? Because there's no record of him like ever. I mean, in Makkah, there's no record.
But notice the statement you're just saying. Yeah, but the statement you're just saying, you're already assuming a lot of things to be true for you to make these, to make this the question to begin with. How about the fact that, what if the notion that he's illiterate is not true? What if he's actually a guy that?
I mean,
what's the evidence that he is illiterate?
The Quran, the Hadith. I mean, it's all overwhelmingly support the idea that he is. And the Quran
it's circular.
No. Well, even the Quran uses the word ummi, I think it is.
Yeah, ummi. I know it has multiple meanings.
Yeah, exactly, right? So
it could mean unlettered, like illiterate. But
it could mean Gentile. That's another valid one.
It could mean Gentile.
So, you see, again, Quran
or
commentators
part of the common folk.
will note this down. So I think it's difficult to try to build entire cases for this. Also, there's hadith that seem to imply he could write. Again, kind of problematic.
But Chris, just quickly, Surah 3, for example, you know, the whole Mary being like casting of lots. Allah supposedly tells Muhammad, oh, by the way, Muhammad, you weren't a witness to this, so this is from the unseen. So, in some weird sense, it's like Muhammad genuinely doesn't have any information about the happenings of how Mary became the guardian of Joseph, right? But then, now, with a sense of hindsight, now that we have the Proto-Evangelion text, it's no longer an unseen story. It's right there in writing, and it's verbatim regurgitated into the Arabic in the Quran, and it's like, that's a little bit odd. How can this illiterate guy verbatim plagiarize that text, right? So anyway,
Do you mind if I
Ibrahim,
chip
do you
in?
see? Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
I wanted to piggyback off this a little bit. This is why I think we need to escape these exceptional claims. I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps the argument very well, because if we make exceptional claims, what happens is, you can find rational answers. Like, for example, there was a person named he was the magician James Randi, and he would reveal all these people who did, like, they claimed to do magic, but then he revealed how they were able to do the things that they were doing. And he put like a $100,000 challenge, and no one was able to meet it. So in this situation, instead of saying, well, he had this exceptional thing, well, he was a merchant that went and spoke with other people. It's quite possible that some of the information could come from there. I think we need to get out of this kind of space of trying to hold these exceptional standards, because once we look into these exceptional standards, they can be met, and then the whole thing can fall apart. And I think that's just not a good way to base your faith on. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think you should base your faith on that type of perspective, you know?
Isa, can you clarify to me,
Sure.
when Muhammad started off his prophethood, and then news reached certain Jews like, oh, there's a prophet in town, so to speak. And apparently he's getting information from God directly because he's this uneducated guy. So then the Jews, according to the story, the Jews were like, this is going to be an interesting test. If he's getting genuine revelations from God, and God knows true stories from false stories, well, we'll test him on the 7 sleepers, and we'll test him on Dhul Qurnayn. And then Muhammad, according to the story, Muhammad goes, I'll give you the answer the next day. But apparently it took him 15 days for him to come up with the answer. And when he came up with the answer...
Well, I think that's because the Quran says that the Prophet doesn't speak except by revelation. So the reason why he waited was because he had to...
Okay, that's all. Yeah. Okay, fine. Let's just say it took him 15 days. Whatever. The point is, Surah 18 is basically what Muhammad would have said in response, where he agrees with the historicity of the 7 sleepers and that there was a Dhul Qurnayn running around seeing the sun set and seeing the sun rise. But what was the Jews' response? They immediately goes, aha, he is false because we chose those stories knowing that they are false stories. So, in other words, a true prophet, right, who is genuinely illiterate, but at the same time genuinely receiving true knowledge from God, if he responded saying, no, there is no such thing as a Dhul Qurnayn, or there is no such thing as the 7 sleepers, they would be impressed, because how would a guy who's illiterate know that those stories are false if he gave the answer saying that they're false? Instead, Muhammad goes along with it. He goes along and agrees with the 7 sleepers and the Dhul Qurnayn story. So that immediately they're like, well, no, he's not getting a revelation from God because he agrees with these stories.
Let's base this down to like a basic level here. The Quran contains within it accounts that we know come from other sources that predate the Quran, some by many hundred years. The Quran quotes them and assigns to them some validity of its historicity, but we know they were never considered historic in nature. And Rob gave the account of the seven sleepers of Ephesus. So why does the Quran, Ibrahim, take from other sources and borrow from them and attribute it to the speech of Allah?
I've heard some people say that the Quran did, but again, like, I mean, I don't see, as I said, like, I believe that the Prophet, peace be upon him, could not read or write, and I believe that he had no motivation, he had no access to those scriptures. Like, for example, a lot of people say that he stole the idea of like an expansion of an expanding universe, or like the formation of life from water from like Greek philosophers or scientists. I don't really buy that, because he didn't have access to those writings in 7th century Arabia.
How do you know that?
Because there's no evidence that he did.
Well, first of all, the fact that he quotes them seems to be evidence of some sort of link. But you also seem to think that he has to be able to read it. Why can't he just hear it?
Because I mean, again, I don't think there's anyone around him who knew those scriptures. I mean, none of the companions, like none of the Sahaba, ever doubted him. Like, I mean, he had like, I think, hundreds of thousands of followers at the conquest of Makkah. He had hundreds of thousands of followers, and none of them ever doubted him. So
okay, wait. First of all, no, I'm pretty sure there were some people who were Muslim then left Islam, according to your own traditions. I know. But the majority of people doubted Muhammad immediately. Like in the early stages, according to the Islamic tradition in Mecca, he was persecuted. He wasn't listened to. He had to rely on Abu Talib and other members of his family to protect him from the pagans of his time, because they didn't trust him at all. In fact, the Quran is full of verses that talk about how Muhammad is just quoting things from other sources. The Quran even records that they called him the ear.
Yeah,
because he just picks things up and he says them again, and that's recorded in the Quran.
So if the Prophet
and
came
these are
up with the
tales
Quran,
of the ancients.
So if the Prophet came up with the Quran, then why would he put that in the Quran? Like, why would he reveal like
perhaps because he thought it was true?
Good question.
I mean, the problem is that
be critical with that question. No, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, be critical. Like, just think. Is it not possible that he heard these as oral traditions? Because again, let's grant he couldn't read or write. So he's hearing in part of Arabia. Arabia, by the way, had a reputation for being a land of heresy at this point in time. There are many heresies that came from Arabia. And there were many you can find in northern Arabia and southern Arabia in Yemen. There were cases of Jews living there and Christians. We don't contest that in the north and south there are Jews and Christians. The idea is whether exactly how much of that had come to the Hijaz in particular. That's up for debate. But Muhammad could have easily heard these stories, especially if he was a trader and he traveled, which is funny enough the standard Islamic narrative. In fact, there's even stories that say that he went all the way to Syria.
Yeah, I think the regions that he traveled to was only Syria. I'm not sure of any other region he went to, because he wasn't like a huge trader. He was more of a small-time trader. So, and also, what about the fact that the Quran actually rebukes the Prophet in several verses? Like, for example, Surah Abasa, the Quran says it rebukes the Prophet for turning away from the blind man. So if the Prophet, peace be upon him, came up with the Quran, then why would he say that about himself? I don't get it.
First of all, I don't think it's quite accurate to say that Muhammad himself came up with the Quran. I think it had a much more organic and lengthy process to how the Quran originally came to how we understand it today. Again, you're thinking that the only solution here is either Muhammad is completely true or that he was a liar. I'm saying no. There's plenty of middle ground there, where Muhammad actually is a real person who did live in Mecca, who genuinely thought he was a prophet, but of whom made errors when he gave recitations of this Quran. That, I think, perfectly explains why he attempts to talk about previous scriptures, the Torah and the Injil, but he gets the stories are slightly different. Probably because he's heard them through oral tradition. And oral tradition tends to pick up variants, as we've long known academically. This is a completely sufficient explanation. It doesn't require us to elevate Muhammad to a very high level. It allows us to look at this in a historic perspective, to look at the earliest manuscripts, any rock inscriptions, anything we want to, even critically evaluate the standard Islamic narrative. We can do all these things. And this, I think, best explains the Quran. It best explains Muhammad. It best explains the early origins of Islam. I think when you start saying things like he couldn't read or write, so it must have been divine. Why would he intentionally fabricate all this stuff? It's either that or he was completely truthful. I'm like, no, you're intentionally not thinking of it critically, and you're taking what someone has probably told you as gospel. Forgive the pun. You know, when really you should be like, well, let's look at this critically here. I'm being told that there was someone called Muhammad who did X, Y, and Z and taught X, Y, and Z. Is that most likely that he was a real prophet from God, or is there another explanation for what's going on here? Is it possible that he had heard things, thought he was a prophet, tried to give his account of the truth as best as he could, but erred because he wasn't a prophet, he was just a man? Is that not possible?
I mean, like, like the Quran itself. I mean, like, again, as someone who has like researched my religion, I mean, when I read the Quran, I can't help but think that, I don't know. I feel like linguistically, the Quran, like in Arabic, is quite. Like there was no other
So,
literature. Like the Quran has
Ibrahim,
shaped the
I
Arabic
I
language.
don't mean to cut you off, but you've done it again, where Chris proposed something and you just ignored it and moved on to a different point. Do you actually at any point ever want to engage with what is being told or talked about?
I mean,
So, like, the Quran being a linguistic miracle has nothing to do with the idea that Muhammad couldn't have potentially just heard these stories.
from who? From who?
From a culture of Christians and Jews that predated him by centuries. Where these, I mean, okay, Dhul Qarnayn. We know the story of Dhul Qarnayn and the building of the Iron Gate and the sun resting in a certain position. We know these predate Muhammad. We know where they came from.
And,
Why is he quoting
ironically,
this story?
It's not just
I think
a
we have to stay away.
religious.
Sorry, please.
It's
go
it's not just a religious origin for the two-horned. It's from the Syriac Alexander romance. It's not just a religious recounting. There's also political issues. You know, the Byzantine Empire and blah blah, and they're basically making this Alexander character righteous. Like apparently he's praising the God of Israel, right? Which, guess what? Surah 18 says the same thing. But we know that's anachronistic because Alexander was living in the 300s BC, not 500s AD situation.
Yeah, but doesn't the
It's
Quran
very
predate
specific.
the? But doesn't the
doesn't-
Quran predate the Alexander romance by 10 years? I've heard it predates it
No.
by about a decade.
No.
The Syriac legend.
No. So the Syriac legend starts around late 200s, early 300s in a very skeletal form. That then becomes a full-fledged around the 560s CE is now the consensus for when the story has its final, like, you know. Then we see the Quran say what it says. That the question is, why do the Jews have this litmus test? Okay, this guy is getting revelation from God. Let's see if he can critique these questions. So, for example, say if Muhammad actually said, no, there is no such thing as Dhul Qarnayn. No, there's no such thing as the seven sleepers. No, Abraham wasn't put into the fiery furnace. That's a mistranslation of the word or. You know, I can, you know, on and on and on. Like in Surah, is it 11 or 12, where Joseph, when he walks into the room and all the women cut their hands, that's from that's from a legend, and they're shocked. Very specific detail. They're shocked. He looks like an angel. He's no mere man. That's a very specific detail.
I mean,
Like that's not in the Torah. That's not in Genesis. These are in Aramaic, Talmudic legends that predated Muhammad but postdates Jesus in the 1st century. In other words, these are legends that came from tafsir, ironically. And then the Quran takes that tafsir, well, Muslims believe. Well, the this is my critique of it. The Quran is nothing but an amalgamation of that tafsir, that human tafsir, as if Allah is the one that's had the final say. Like, yes, that's true, that's true, that's true. So let's just, for the sake of argument, okay, here's a thought experiment, Ibrahim. Imagine you are not a Muslim, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Imagine you're lost on an island and you had no concept of the Quran, you had no concept of Muhammad, or let's just say hypothetically you were atheist slash maybe spiritual, and on the beach, boom, you bump into this thing called the Quran. Now,
Okay.
let's just say you open the book and you're like, oh, interesting, apparently this is recounting history, because it does speak about, say, the house of Moses, the house of Abraham, and like in Surah 3. Surah 3 in Imran over there. Let's just say on this island you then come across a supercomputer, a vast library there in the middle of the island. Now, obviously, if you have an intriguing mind, you'll be like, ooh, here's my opportunity to really learn about history. Okay, this can include, say, the history of the universe.
Okay.
What
Yeah.
will you then do? You will then compare, like as if you're comparing notes. You compare the Quran's version of history. What really did happen to Moses, Abraham, XYZ, versus, so the Quran's version versus what actually happened in history based on the supercomputer. If the two contradict each other, which would you ultimately accept? The Quran's version or the supercomputer's memory of history?
I mean, to be fair, I mean that analogy wouldn't. I don't really know how it would work, because if I was living on an island, I wouldn't really know what a supercomputer is. I mean, it's a bit. I don't.
I think that's a very.
Oh gosh, it's a thought experiment.
It's a thought experiment, though. You need to sort of meet halfway, and meet Rob what he's trying to illustrate here.
But I wouldn't really know, like, if I was, again. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this isn't...
The reason why I'm saying supercomputer is because the supercomputer will take you through the simulations. It'll actually, if you can even put like a virtual headset on, and it doesn't have to be an instant, like one evening homework preparation. You could spend years on this island learning from the supercomputer about everything you need to know about life. And then you have the Quran in the other hand. If there's a contradiction between the two, say if the supercomputer is giving genuine history, right?
Okay.
If the supercomputer contradicts the Quran, then what does that imply about the Quran?
I mean, well, obviously, I'm not going to say that the Quran is wrong. I'm not going to say that. I mean, I can't really, but
you see, Ibrahim, this is why
Rob,
you're
then
stuck.
This is the cognitive dissonance kicking in.
Rob, can I give a simpler example? That's
even as a Christian,
analogous?
I would say that if the Bible contradicted history, I'd be like, yeah, the Bible's wrong. Like,
I know, but obviously,
I
can't say.
I'm not gonna get lightning struck.
Can I give a simpler example, Rob, that is analogous to Muhammad and the challenge from the Jews? Ibrahim, very simple question.
Yeah.
If tomorrow I claim to be a messenger of Allah and word got around, and then the Muslims came to me and asked me 3 questions. They'd ask me, who is your Lord? What is his book? Who's his messenger? Right? I go away, I come back to them, and I say, Ahura Mazda, the Avestas, and Zoroastra. What would they say to me?
That you're false. It's
okay,
wrong.
Awesome. And that's basically what happened with Muhammad and the Jews.
I've never heard of that. I mean, I have heard that. I don't know what the reference for the authenticity for that is, but again, I mean, what about all the predictions?
Okay, then this comes back to my wait. This comes back then to my thought experiment. Let's pretend we don't even have that story. Oh, say if we do have the story, but then you're like, no, I still don't believe the story because it's a third-party story, whatever. Fine. Guess what we do have, you and I, right now in front of us? The Quran. All right? Yeah. So, The Quran says that Allah took mud from earth, yanked it up to heaven, and created Adam up there, and the angels was prostrating to Adam, and Iblis was there. That's what the Quran says in regards to the human condition, the first human being. Okay, how the first human being was born, right? Or
Yeah.
created. Now, I'm assuming you don't hold to human evolution, for example.
No, not really. No.
There you go. So, human evolution is a fact. We come from Africa. It's called the out of Africa model. The modern Homo sapiens are around 300,000 years old. They migrate into the Persian Gulf, and then from there you have the Table of Nations, as Genesis 10 talks about. But the Quran's version of of Adam being yanked, like Earth's being taken up to heaven, and then there's this angelic council discussion and Iblis prostrating. Guess where that comes from? Not from the Bible. It comes from a pseudepigraphical story called The Life of Adam and Eve, which is a 1st century CE myth or a tafsir. It's an added it's like an added fleshed out version of the Adam and Eve story, to fill in all the missing details that Genesis left out. But we all know it's someone's imagination. Like what if Adam was having a discussion with Michael and the angels, and maybe Satan came in among them, and maybe Michael told Satan, "Hey, you need to give respect to this earth-like being that Yahweh's created." And then Satan was like, "No, I was born before him. I'm a smokeless fire." I'm deliberately quoting certain terms, by the way, smokeless fire and so on, because that's in the legend. But that also appears in the Quran. So immediately red flag, because it's like, dude, I know where the story comes from. It's a fake, false, human-made-up thing that the Quran is repeating. And it contradicts science. Completely.
Well, yeah, I would agree that you can't have a viable scientific reading of the Quran. It seems to be borrowing from other understandings that predate the Quran, again, which is not a surprise because we find this all over the place. The Quran doesn't have an issue with borrowing stuff. It just doesn't. But Muslims try to read into it. Actually, no, the Quran is a divine text. It has to be directly the words of Allah, even though it obviously has human origin in it. It's evidence. The Quran it doesn't try to hide it. It's very open about the fact that there is human elements in its revelation. So how do you explain that? I can explain that very simply. Muhammad was a human being. He said things. They were recorded down. They made their way into the Quran. A lot of it is in error. He said some things that were true.
Oops. Someone's...
I'm not sure. Oh,
that's my kid, sorry.
Woody, are you a Muslim?
No, I'm atheist.
Okay.
But I am doing Bible studies.
Do you have anything to add to the Quran preservation topic? Oh, did Ibrahim drop? I think Ibrahim left.
When you go back to the Torahs, the word prophets that made prophecies of hardship, didn't they? Of how the Jews will have a hardship, they'll have a trial, and then they'll go back and they'll succeed. What prophecies did Muhammad make if he was a prophet?
Yeah, well, he doesn't really. At least it doesn't seem clear in the Quranic text. That's yeah. It's a good point that he doesn't have any prophecies that seem to go in his favor. Now, Muslims will try and say certain things are prophecies, but when you investigate it, I think there are better alternative explanations for that are again much more simpler, that don't involve reading into the text.
Yeah.
I am going to start wrapping this up, guys, because it is 10 o'clock where I am, the UK. And I'm going to start sort of bringing this to a close. We've been going for 3 hours now. Well, about 3 hours pretty much on the clock. Is there anything you guys would like to say and wrap up?
I have something to say, if that's cool.
Go on, then, Lisa.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So I think this is really important. I think this conversation is really important. And I think it's an important question theologically. Where do you situate your faith? And I think if you situate your faith on saying, well, my text is the best text, and, I have all these exceptional claims, like I have the best science, it's going to fail you. And that's not, I don't think that's where you should situate your faith. You should situate your faith in a different place. I would say things like ethics, morals, spirituality. These are more, I think, stronger places to hedge your theology. But if you're saying, well, my book is the most special book, and you don't know about any other books, and then you do faulty polemics about other books, I don't think that's a really good place to be, theologically speaking. I also think it's not good, theologically speaking, to say, well, make lots of heavy claims and not really have the skill set to even engage these claims. And then when your claims are challenged, not really being able to assess them, but then kind of like trying to use circular reasoning and then basically doing tu quoque and saying, well, what about like the problems with my position? I'm going to go and see the problems of other people's positions. This is the thing that I've been seeing a lot in this space, in these spaces of apologetics. And particularly, I'm going to be very transparent within the Muslim community, which I think it's really sad and it's disappointing. And I think that the apologetics are just not good. And I'm just very disappointed. That's really all I can say about it. And I'm honestly going to say, I think the Christians are doing a much better job in the apologetics. And I think I've watched your video, Chris, where you talk about that all the Muslim apologists are running away. And I think it makes sense because they're not putting their faith in a good place. They're not hedging their faith in a strong place. And that's why it's kind of collapsing, because when you just say, my text is the best text of all time, and then you find out that this is not necessarily true, you make these very high and mighty claims, and then you can't actually back up those claims, you look not too very intelligent. You don't look like a very intelligent person. And I think that's just, it's tragic and it's sad. So, thank you for having me on the panel. I appreciate it.
Of course.
And
yeah, it's a pleasure having you, man.
I just feel sad. I feel sad about, what I see.
But... if you keep talking this way, you're going to get accused of being like a secret Christian. So you might as well want to reaffirm that you are Muslim. Just sit harder and get worse.
Or you could be like, hey, maybe this is a good time to look at this Christianity thing, Maybe. But in all seriousness, Issa, thank you for coming on the stream. You're very well spoken and you're very polite, and I always respect that. I always look for people who I can have conversations with that go into very deep topics, and you can follow that. And obviously, like you say, you're getting a master's degree in Islamic studies, or you're studying too, and that's amazing stuff. So yeah, you're always welcome to come back on whenever you want, Issa. And thank you for being here.
Issa, you should write a book one day so I can quote you as an authority.
I've actually written papers and stuff.
And also, sorry, Issa, before you go, I'd love to have a discussion with you sometime about why John 14:6 is true.
Sure, we can talk about anything. You do have my email. That's probably the best way to reach me. So I'll put that in the private chat.
Anyway.
Yeah, Rob does have a YouTube channel.
Yeah.
I just want to brag about Rob's YouTube channel. He has Sentinel Apologetics. He does absolutely amazing videos. I have learned a lot from his studies, the content that he makes, and also, to be honest with you, his live streams where he gets into conversations with other Muslims and people from other perspectives. I thoroughly enjoy that. You guys should check him out at Sentinel Apologetics.
Thank you, man.
David doesn't have a channel.
Am I breaking up?
Because David is boring.
Maybe I'm breaking up.
A tiny bit, but you're okay.
Okay.
We should all yell at David to make it.
David's
an independent contractor.
You need to get on the ball,
to make everyone else look good.
There are super chats. I'm just going to go through these real quick. Let's have a look. So we have you guys spoken about what the Quran says about Aesop? Apparently he's a Muslim too. Don't know how Muhammad came to that conclusion. I'm not too sure what this is in reference to. Do any of you guys know? I don't know what's in reference to. I'm guessing what the Quran says about Aesop. No idea. I'm afraid that just completely went past my head, 19 Dynasty 7, but no worries. Periodic Z Says Muhammad had lots of benefits of starting Islam and had a very bad reputation being called the B word. Muhammad worked in a caravan for his wife, so we heard stories and people called him the ear. RC proves this. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say that there are like everything is bad for like there is no reason to be a prophet, and you can't really say there's every reason to be a prophet. I think the truth is somewhere in between there. Like I thought a more nuanced view, I think is kind of important when we remember, like Muhammad could have had reasons to be a prophet, beneficial, like in terms of benefits, but there's also negatives that come with that. So yeah, you got to kind of balance it out. And then of course, thank you, Issa, again. Yeah, it's good to have you on, man. I'll be praying for you because I very much hope that one day you become a brother to me in faith.
Amen. Thank you.
Great stuff, man. Cool.
If
Do any
you
of
ever
you guys
come to London, we'll like grab you and just like dunk you in some water and baptize you.
Yeah. the covert baptism, real quick. Cool. Any more closing remarks by anybody?
It appears
I think the
okay.
last one. What I want to say is there are people that have a gift, and I think Chris, you're one of them, where you can just truncate down and get straight to the point. I lack that gift. Like, so I was really struggling how to get Ibrahim, for example, to criticize his position. I can waffle on into very detailed sort of analogies, but I think that discussion is an example where if we're going to be effective, the first thing we need to do is get at the root of the issue, which is the cognitive dissonance evidently at play, before we can even get to say the meat. So that's just a statement for anyone hearing that. Like, in other words, if you're going to go out in the field and speak with Muslims, that discussion is an example of what I'm trying to communicate. So,
Rob, it's okay. I understand you.
I want to say that, Rob, I mean, what I like about you, Rob, is that you can take very complicated things and just express them in quite an entertaining way. So like this is why I like watching your live streams, because you can just go like, right, let's take this topic and just go crazy into it and just derive so many amazing like nuggets of truth from it.
yeah.
I love that because like the analytical side of me is like, I really like this. So yeah, everyone has their gifts, but thank you very much for that. I really appreciate that. David, do you have any closing remarks?
Muslims, we love you, but we are going to challenge you, okay? God bless.
Yes. Yes, we will. We will keep challenging and keep pushing this because it's important that Muslims know the truth. And as Rob said, John 14:6, the way, the truth, and the life is found in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, thank you everyone for tuning in. Oh, were you going to say something? Was that you, Rob? Was David
alone?
Ah,
no,
right.
I was going. Yeah.
Sounded a bit like being inquisitive there. Nah, not a kidding. All right then. God bless you all. Thank you for joining, and I'll see you on the next stream. Take care, guys. God bless.
You too. Thank you.